Okay.
Okay, hello and welcome to everyone who's joining today's COPA safety seminar on aircraft maintenance. It is a pretty jam-packed day, so thank you very much for spending your Saturday morning/afternoon with us. I myself, I'm Sharon Chung. I'm the Director of National Programming here at the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, who many of you know and love. So we'll jump right into it. With plenty of questions, so add them to the chat that you see in the room here. If you want to make the screen bigger, there is a little red button that allows you to toggle off the chat. Feel free to poke in and out of the chat itself from time to time, as I'll provide updates there. We've had a very successful year so far. We're now a few months into our first year in our safety program, hosting these monthly safety seminars. Peter, who you can see on the screen as well, Peter Campbell, our Director of External Relations, put together the schedule here for 2022. And so I wanted to provide an opportunity for you to provide any commentary, perhaps even suggest any speakers, as we'll be jumping right into it. As you see, there's already dates confirmed and plenty of speakers. So the content will be quite diverse, from ultralight operations to weather phenomenon to your first cross country. Of course, with our new drone membership options that we introduced in May, we'll ensure there's plenty of content to learn more about everything from the recreational side of improving your skill sets to perhaps learning more about what drone within the aviation sector looks like, what airports are doing, especially here in Canada. There are very progressive airports that are making a big difference when it comes to advanced air mobility, when it comes to drone services. So take a look. Let us know if you have any ideas. I will be sending out a survey after today's seminar, soliciting any feedback that you may have or ideas that you may have. And moving forward, we're very excited to share with you that we are able to offer a aircraft insurance incentive with Magnus. So it's a accident forgiveness incentive, as well as a deductible waive. So take a look at the screen. By participating in these safety seminars, or if you would like to call them rust removers, whatever language or synonym you prefer to use, participating in these sessions, as well as today's pilot recurrent training, it does offer you some support in terms of that deductible. So I will share this in a email after this event, so I won't dwell on it too long, as of course we want to get to the meat of today's presentation. So continue forward here. There are some conditions in participating, of course, within the incentive itself. And last but not least, as I go through this presentation, there are perks in terms of being a COPA member. You have participated, many of you have participated in various seminars throughout the year, and so every time you attended, you receive an additional entry to one of these 3 great prizes. So take a look at your screen, and maybe some of these stand out to you: a big old Garmin AirWatch, a Sirius XM package, an Aircraft Spruce $100 gift card. I have that on my desk right now. It's pretty tempting to not use. So that will be very exciting. We'll conduct the annual draw in December at the year end, and 3 lucky winners will receive one of these prize packs. Okay, I'm seeing a ton of comments here, so thank you everybody for already introducing yourselves and providing some information. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We will be getting into, of course, the aircraft maintenance. There's 2 parts of the presentation here, and Peter and Roger will walk you through specifically what topics will be mentioned. Of course, with any program that we have the benefit of some fantastic sponsors. We have ForeFlight with us here today. Adrian Tegler is in the room, who's been an airline pilot, as well as with the ForeFlight team for, I believe, almost coming up to nearly a decade. So that's fantastic. So he'll share some specific functions and capabilities that tie back into aircraft maintenance after the first presentation, and then we'll go into a break. So with that, I hope that was, that was within about 5 minutes, so I won't take up more of your time here. Peter, I welcome you on the virtual stage to start sharing your screen and get right into it.
Good morning, ladies and gents. I'm going to get the presentation going right now. So here we are. So welcome to our COPA Safety Seminar Series, which a lot of times features products that are also known as Smart Pilot. Not today. This is a special one in our safety program, or also known as our security program de security de la COPA. And so we are going to get right to it because we've got lots to get to today. I'm co-hosting today with Roger Hildesheim, who I will introduce in a moment. Again, to introduce himself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Campbell. I am currently the COPA Director of External Relations and have been so for about a year. My background is a combination of private and commercial fixed wing and rotary wing flying, both in the civilian world, and 33 years in the RCAF flying on jets and helicopters in Canada and many other spots around the world. Also 2 years of operational experience in Afghanistan with a small UAV RPAS known as Scan Eagle. And before I was with COPA, I was the general manager and chief flying instructor at the Ottawa Flying Club based in Ottawa. I'd like to turn over the slide deck for a moment and offer the microphone over to Roger Hildesheim, good friend of mine, who we've known for a few years. We flew together at the Smiths Falls Flying Club. Roger is a man of many talents, and I won't steal any of his words. I'll let him take the stage and introduce himself. Roger, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. And yeah, I've been flying. My background's in gliders. Both my parents were glider pilots. Our daughter is currently a first officer for Jazz. So flying's kind of in the family. I've been instructing in gliders for over 40 years. Also been flying power for a little less than that, and flying tow planes, tail draggers. Was a member of the Canadian gliding team at the Pan American Championships a few years ago. Got about 2,500 hours instructing and flying in gliders, and probably about 500-600 hours in powered aircraft. And you know, between all of that and the instructing, I was also a president and CFI at the Gatineau Gliding Club for many, many years. I do a lot of these safety seminars within the gliding community, and in the last few years also with the powered community, focusing on tail draggers, aero towing, and the unique aspects of that. And the reason I can do all this stuff is because of the job I have, which is a senior systems staff engineer with Lockheed Martin. And that's really my background. So over to you, Peter.
Roger, why don't you also tell us about what we're doing today?
Yeah, so we're going to walk through details of maintaining your aircraft and what's involved. We all know all the little detail, well, I shouldn't say little details, but we all kind of have a 10,000-foot view. And I'm sure some of us have a varying degree of interaction and engagement with aircraft maintenance. And what Peter and I are going to be walking through today is sowing the seeds for another presentation that's coming in October, but also just to maybe highlight why you should have more than a cursory interest in the maintenance and airworthiness of the aircraft that you're essentially putting your life in the hands of. It's not like taking a car, to a dealership and great things happen and you get it back. We'd like to think that as private pilots and as an airmanship side, we're a little bit more involved. There's always things that need to be done. There's things that are maybe watch items for the aircraft, a particular model of aircraft. And it's really hard to disassociate yourself. So we're going to start talking through a bunch of topics, everything from the paperwork that's involved, what you should be engaged with, the regulations, and what sort of latitude they allow you as non-commercial registered aircraft. I think, Peter, we could say that the focus really is on non-commercial aircraft.
Absolutely.
Right? And you know, just sort of remind the stuff that we probably knew really, really well when we did our PPL written exam, but we've maybe forgotten or maybe need a refresher as to why it might be important to get our hands dirty during annual inspection time. So
right on, Roger. Thank you very much. The other thing that we do want to mention and not forget is that this is a Transport Canada approved pilot recurrency training program briefing today. Meets the requirements of CAR 40105 2A, and we'll be giving you details at the end on how to fill out your logbook. Le COPA est fier de vous annoncer que cette formation périodique est approuvée par Transport Canada et donc répond aux exigences du programme de formation périodique pour les pilotes. All right. So what are we talking about? So the COPA mission, the COPA safety program mission, is pretty simple. We want to reduce the number of general aviation and recreational pilot-flown aircraft accidents. How? Pretty simple. We think by facilitating the transformation of how we fly, how we think, and how we act about flying when we're flying. This is our agenda for today. We've talked about the safety program, the fact that this is a PRTP. We'll tell you at the end how we log that in our logbooks. The main themes for today are on this slide as well. So aircraft ownership. If you're new to the game of aircraft ownership, you've got some new responsibilities. We're going to talk about aircraft airworthiness, what that means, aircraft maintenance, how that's done, dealing with snags or defects on your aircraft, dealing with aircraft airworthiness directives, and looking at safety bulletins. We're going to offer you a whole bunch of aircraft maintenance tips, traitement des CN et des bulletins de sécurité, conseils pour la maintenance des aéronefs, des références et conclusion, résumé et conclusion. Okay, so Roger, I'm going to turn it back over to you and we can talk about that airplane ownership feel.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So congratulations, you're an airplane owner, and maybe some of you have been a fairly recent acquisition to the family, and I think most of us would say an aircraft is like having another family member, good, bad, and ugly days with it. But you know, there's a few steps, you know, in owning an aircraft, and the first of all is making sure you actually own the aircraft. I'm sure you've heard horror stories with cars and, heaven forbid, your homes and things like that. So, you know, has all the ownership transfer paperwork been completed? And there's some timelines, and we'll get into some of that a little long. We'll talk about who's responsible for, you know, the paperwork and go through, and we'll walk through that registration process just to make sure we're clear. You know, part of the certification of the aircraft and registration of the aircraft is, you know, what do you have to do when you do the form? Years ago, boy, this goes back probably 30 years, when you changed ownership of an aircraft, you had to submit a separate form into TC. You had to wait for that to be processed. But, you know, as of the last 20, 25 years, they came with a tearaway form, which we'll walk through, and essentially gives you a temporary registration for a period of time. And I believe it's 90 days to get the processing through, right, Peter?
That is correct, 90 days.
90 days. And so, you know, literally, as long as you got insurance and you got the registration form filled out and you get it sent into Transport Canada, and of course, the aircraft is airworthy, you're good to go. It's golden. The joys of buying an aircraft that's been registered in Canada. Very straightforward compared to importing from another country with a myriad of different types of aircraft. So at the end of the day, you'll get your new C of R from transport with your name on it, but you have a 90-day window when you go through that. So I think the next few slides talk about that, Peter.
Yep. Don't forget the fee of $110, and we'll jump into the form, Roger. Thank you.
Yep. I think the form's yellow, if I remember correctly, or off yellow. It looks like this. You'll notice, and you probably have seen the C of R and said, you know, what is this doing here? What's this tearaway? Get rid of it. Hopefully you're not the type of person that likes to rip tabs off of stuffed pillows and things like that. Please keep the tab with the forms when you have it, because if you sell your aircraft, it's an easy way for your new owner to go through and get it registered and at least get up into the air or fly at home from where they're going.
Yeah, this is the online form. Sorry, Roger. This is the online form, but the one that's in your airplane looks almost identical.
Yeah. Yeah. Next slide.
There we go.
So it's basically very similar to, I would say, most provincial ownership transfer forms that you have for your cars.
Yep.
You know, contact information, who's responsible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I cannot emphasize the importance of making sure the insurance is set up appropriately. A lot of people will transfix on the registration and C of A and everything else and annual inspections, and then realize, ooh, I better check with my insurance company, particularly if you're making a leap from a fixed gear aircraft to a retractable gear aircraft. Your insurance company may have something to say about that, either in skill levels and things like that, or additional training that may be required. And you can bet probably some sort of increase in your premium. So keep the big picture, make sure you work through the details. It's good to write down little checklists. We're pilots, we live in checklists. Doesn't hurt to run through these types of things with the transfer of aircraft.
Well,
next slide. And I think this is the last bottom end of the form. It gives you the instructions, where to find the information on the aircraft, the data plates, serial numbers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Please be meticulous with this. I have seen many registration transfers go sideways because somebody transposed a serial number and somebody at transport caught it, and then you're caught in the machine. And before you know it, it's a long drawn out process. So, you know, dig into your inner Teutonic heritage if you have any, and please be very detail oriented when you do this type of paperwork.
Right on, Rogers. Thanks. And a couple of key things that goes with this, of course, is that the information that you put down in your address especially is going to come back, whereas where the C of R actually shows up, where the certificate of airworthiness shows up, where annual aircraft airworthiness inspection reports come from, where airworthiness directives go to. So it's really important that you get it right the first time, as Roger said, because a whole myriad of things will come out of this registration process. Really important. All right, on to just kind of repeating what we said a few slides ago, but you know, who's responsible? You are. Who is responsible for the registration and maintenance, scheduled maintenance of the aircraft? You are, because you, as it says in the cars, are responsible for the care and custody of the aircraft, right? And for this PRTP, let's identify that you are the person that's responsible for the aircraft maintenance. Now, if, on the other hand, you are part of a group of people that has bought this airplane, whether it's a company or not, just, you know, maybe you're sharing the ownership, it's really important that within that group, we define some responsibilities so that you know and that transport knows who is the person that they're supposed to be getting a hold of, right? Because there'd be lots of things that will occupy your time sometimes. Did I jump? No, I didn't. Okay. All right, so what do we talk about care and custody? What does that mean? Well, if you look in CARS 605-84, there's a bunch of things that come out of care and custody. So one of the things is that we want to make sure that the aircraft is maintained in accordance with the type design specifications and the certificate of airworthiness for that certified aircraft, like a Cessna 172 or an Aranca Champ, right? Need to be complying with all airworthiness directives and their equivalents. You need to ensure that the original and the updated weight and balance information for the aircraft is available, right? The most recent one, of course, should be in the aircraft documentation. Keep the aircraft weight and balance up to date if equipment or aircraft changes or upgrades are done, and meet the requirements for a change in the aircraft weight and balance. You need to appreciate the owner's versus mechanic roles and responsibilities. And we've got a slide in a couple of moments from the FAA about knowing your AME coming up. And it's very important.
And Peter, one of the elements with the weight and balance, that people think just because I'm switching out radios or whatever in the aircraft, I have to go and get a complete weight and balance redone. If it's a relatively minor swap out of equipment like that, you just need to amend your weight and balance equipment list, and it does require a full weighing and getting scales and everything else, right? So
right, very true, very true, sir. Well said. All right, care and custody. It also means that you are setting up the maintenance schedules either in accordance with the manufacturer's or in accordance with Transport Canada schedules as are laid out in the air regulations. You plan the work and you task and assist your AME to do the work. And that's what this video that we're going to see in a minute is all about, right? You need to know so that you can advocate for yourself, right? Knowledge is power, and it's so true when it comes to owning and maintaining your airplane. Classic case of being your own advocate, and an excellent example of how you can learn and be one with your airplane. Like Roger says, airplane ownership is best experienced when you get your hands dirty. All right, I'm going to jump the slide here, and then I'm going to go to our video. And we're going to play that, and I'm going to turn off my mic.
When the aircraft you fly needs maintenance, having a good rapport with the mechanic can mean a lot. Communications is the key. That's why whenever I have a maintenance question, I go to Donald here.
David.
What?
David Hayes.
We'll talk about communications with your mechanic next on 57 Seconds to Safer Flying. Have I calling you the wrong thing the whole time?
Keep your hands in your pockets. Come on.
Building a friendly but businesslike relationship fosters communications. When you ask the right questions and start a discussion around components of your aircraft, that mechanic might take the time to educate you on how the system works in your aircraft and how that system integrates with other systems in your aircraft. Your understanding leads to your confidence in that mechanic to perform the work needed. The mechanic then feels you are interested in how things work. Before you know it, he or she is offering ways for you to head off other problems before they become major issues. So much of what I'm saying is common sense, but sometimes we pilots are busy and don't have the time to form that relationship. Other best practices would include having the mechanic do a walk around with you when the work or inspection is ordered, and then again when the work or inspection is completed. Have the mechanic show you the work plus any inspection plates, cables, hoses, clamps, castellated nuts, safety wire, anything that might have been involved in the work.
Give me a 7/16 wrench over there. A wrench.
For the FAA safety team, I'm Phil Dixon.
And I'm David Hayes. Join me for my Aviation Maintenance Safety Minutes on YouTube's FAA channel.
Here. So those two gentlemen have a whole series of excellent slides, presentations that they do, and I would recommend that you go to the FAA website and find the 57-second videos and watch a lot of them, because they really are, they're also deadpan funny, I think, and the humor was quite evident, self-evident in that presentation, and it's a great way to get through this topic. If we haven't said it enough, we'll say it one more time. Who's responsible for maintenance? You are, right? And that's a good thing, because it's your airplane, right? There's a bunch of things we're going to talk about today, but we're going to talk right now for this next few minutes on maintenance schedules. Roger, I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And yes, you are the responsible person. And you know, I think it behooves us all to get out of this mindset that, you know, I have to have this annual done, or I have to have this 50-hour inspection if you're a commercial or whatever program you're using for maintenance. It's not a have to have, it's need to have, because I need to stay alive for my family. Sounds very harsh, but let's get realistic, folks, right? This is a big deal. So, you know, part of this is identifying what maintenance schedule you're going to follow, and we'll talk about that more later on. It can be over intervals or operating cycles. It could be a manufacturer's recommended approach. I know a lot of FTUs that fly Cessna products use the Cessna progressive maintenance schedules of, you know, 50, 100, 150, 200-hour cycles with keeps repeating itself around and around. But for most of us weekend warriors and things like that, you know, we're in an annual inspection cycle, and you know, we can either follow a manufacturer's maintenance schedule, or I'm sure, like most of us, will use the default Transport Canada cycle. One element I'll mention here, and this is about trying to get out of the mindset of, oh, I have to have the annual done, is at our gliding club, we have two tow planes, and one is the Piper Pawnee, climbs like a homesick angel, and another one's a Citabria, both tail draggers. Both lead very rough lives, towing aircraft up and down, day in, day out. You get to know an aircraft after a while, and you get to know the weaknesses and the strengths of it. And yes, we could blindly carry on and just have an annual inspection on our tow planes as we go through. But we know where the weak areas are. So what we actually do is, outside of the maintenance schedule, we will replace key load carrying bolts and things like that on the tail wheel assemblies annually, whether they need it or not. Our AME will go and we ask them to do it, because we know the bolts on the tail wheels take an incredible amount of load, and the springs and everything. Every annual, we replace those bolts. Every 2 years, if you are familiar with the Citabria American Champion, the main gear, steel gear, the bolts that hold that, there's 4 massive bolts on there. We replace those whether they need to be replaced or not, because there's been many documented cases of where the bolts have let loose after, you know, fatigue and X number of cycles, and the aircraft has come down on one side. So I like to think after a while we get into a progressive mindset, and that's what Peter and I are trying to lay the groundwork for. Is it's in your best interest. Every aircraft has strengths and weaknesses, and if you get that relationship with your AME and you get that relationship with your aircraft, you know where they are, and you could say, you know what, I'm going to spend an extra $200 and replace these bolts for the extra hour it'll take, and I'm going to have a much more reliable, safe aircraft. So, you know, that's next level thinking, but let's worry about the basics here as we go forward. So, next slide.
Absolutely, well said.
Yeah, my father worked a lot in maintenance, and you know, the whole concept of preventative maintenance is good. So logbooks, where do you record the work? Journey log, technical log, you got propeller log, you got an engine logbook. All of these elements. A good old glider is very straightforward. We use the journey log for everything, including technical work, and that's allowed in the cars. The use of airtime is what is entered into the books, but what documentation, you know, what maintenance has been done, even an oil change, you know, what parts have been installed, mods to equipment lists, mods that may drive a change to center of gravity calculations or weight and balance reweighing, all those elements. probably one of the most overlooked things, and I catch this a lot with people, is something as simple as an oil change on your aircraft, which you're allowed to do as elementary maintenance. We'll talk more later. People are very diligent and will say that in the journey log, blah, 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 have replaced with W100 shell, blah, 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 8 quarts, whatever the case may be. But they won't put that in the technical log. And you need to put, because it is technical work, it has to be both in the journey log and the technical log. So just a little tidbit, hopefully something you take away from the session today. If you do your oil change, just make sure you put an entry in the technical log as well. Next slide there, Peter.
Yeah. Next slide on journey logs. And thanks, Roger. I'll take over the mic for a second.
Yep, you got it.
So journey logbooks. So we've talked about 2 different types of logs: tech log, journey log. So the journey logbook is the one that you're going to take with you most of the time, right? Flights, defects, repairs, inspections, all that stuff will go in the journey log. And if you're a Star Trek fan, you always remember Captain Kirk or Captain whomever, journey logbook entry, start date, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's what we're talking about, right? It's the same thing. It's carried on board unless the departure and arrival location are the same, or if you're a balloon pilot, it's made immediately available to you before and after the flight, but not while you're flying. Journey logbooks, all aircraft except ultralights, hang gliders, and remotely piloted aircraft. Technical logbooks, as Roger said, not required for balloons, gliders, amateur-built, and owner-maintained aircraft. Okay, tech records. All right, that's the other side of the coin, right? So if you're into technical records, you will have a couple. You'll have one for the airframe, the engine. You may have one, if it's a constant speed prop, you will have one. But for the last few years, in most cases, prop inspections have also gone in the engine logbook. But if you want to have it separately, you can, right? Modifications as well. Flights, repairs, and maintenance work, perform inspections, 80s, etc. Keeping the tech logs is kind of a mirror image of the journey log. They also need the details from the AME that did the work. And le tech record est conservé pendant toutes les durées de vie de l'avion et doit être protégé. In other words, keep them safe, keep them away from the aircraft, have them available, of course, but don't lose them, because if it comes a time when the aircraft is sold, those records are like gold. And if they're not there, it will greatly diminish the sale of the airplane. All right, let's not forget what we need to put in the logbooks after the work is done. We've kind of talked about it, but here's just another slide all about it. So who's putting the entry in? By the person who performed it. And there are details on that in CAR 57103 and CAR 60585. And by the way, I didn't mention it. I'll mention it now. This entire presentation is going to be available to you. So there's no need to be sitting in class right now, taking crib notes, scrambling things down, or scratching things down, or taking screenshots, because this whole presentation is going to be available to you. So allow yourself to sit back, enjoy the presentation. If you want to make notes, by all means do, but you don't need to be capturing any of it, because this is all going to be available to you. What goes in the record? A brief description of the work performed, the standard used, other than manufacturer recommendations, any outstanding work, the date and person or AME who performed the work, and if applicable, a maintenance release by the aircraft maintenance engineer or the aircraft maintenance organization or the owner. Roger, do you want anything to what we've said here?
No, I think that's a good element. That's sort of the standard entry, and I'm even anal when I get to things like throwing, when I put an extra liter of oil, quart of oil in an engine, I make sure I put an entry in the journey log on that too. I keep thinking the journey and technical logs are your history, and you hit it really well, Peter. It's in your interest, and it's going to affect the resale value of your aircraft beyond just keeping a good history of what's happening to it. So,
right on, Roger. Over to you, sir.
Okay, who's responsible? Well, you've heard this many times, and this was a shift in the regulations. Boy, this goes back again about 35 years with the old Canadian regulations, and it shifted. It used to be that the AME was responsible for, checking for applicable ADs during an annual inspection or recurring maintenance activity, etc. But that changed. And that changed in that the AME is responsible for the quality of the work and implementing the applicable airworthiness directive. But in terms of identifying what airworthiness directives, as an example, are applicable to the aircraft, that's the owner. Now, I have yet to run across an AME that is that black and white, that sits there and crosses his arms and says, you don't tell me, blah, blah, blah. They will usually ask, but you should have a relationship with your AME. And the AME I use for my glider and for my Champ, we have an excellent relationship. And part of my responsibility in preparing for annual inspections, and we have a whole different presentation talking about these aspects in October, is I go on to the COPA site, which we talk about a little later on, and I download applicable ADs, and I put them out. I say, are they applicable to my serial number? Blah, 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 blah. Go through, and I throw them in front of the AME and said, yeah, no, this isn't applicable, but these are. At the same time, there's been a couple of ADs that have popped out of the blue, and, print them out. My AME knows everything about the airworthiness and potential airworthiness issues of the aircraft to the same level that I do. And it's a mutual trust. It's a symbiotic relationship. If we go back to our old biology classes, you have to have a relationship. You cannot just toss the keys over the fence and say, fix it. You may do that with your car, but believe me, when you're stuck in a little field and something isn't right, having a good understanding of your aircraft may get you back home safely.
Right on.
Next slide. So responsibility for maintenance. Some key appendices, and I'm sure, of all these appendices, as a private owner, you should be intimately familiar with Appendix A of 625, elementary work, right? What can you do? Okay, it doesn't mean you can do it and there's no entries in the logbooks. It means you can do these tasks, but you put the entry in there and you can say it's been done, You can replace a tire as long as you don't break a hydraulic line. Elements like that. And it's very important. You can clean the crud off your spark plugs. All that good 100 low lead leftovers, residue. You can do stuff like that. And knowing what you can and cannot do is very good understanding. And it's part of that relationship with your AME. And it also helps define understanding your aircraft and working with your AME for what are the weak areas, what are the trouble areas, what do you need to watch out for your particular aircraft, because every aircraft has warts, right? Every model has known deficiencies that aren't exactly perfect and not necessarily all caught by ADs. Some of them are just known wear items, right? So you got to work with your AME very closely on these elements. And, one of the things Peter and I were talking about yesterday is Appendix G would probably be a worthwhile read as well in detail, is what's the definition of an abnormal event? When is a hard landing hard enough to be an abnormal event? Right. When is a little bit of hanger rash versus an abnormal event? Take a read through that. It'll be a little bit enlightening, I'm sure, for most of us online. Anyway, next slide, Peter.
Thank you, and I'll take the mic back now. Thanks. So now we're getting into the meat of it. Now we're into schedules, right? When we talk about maintenance intervals, it is very important that we differentiate between calendar intervals for things like annuals and timed intervals for things such as the hours that have been put on the magneto in your engine, which, by the way, is typically every 500 hours, unless you got one of those fancy new electronic magnetos. Note that the last annual inspection expires at the end of the month that it was signed off on. So, example, if your annual was signed off on August of 8th in 2021, your annual will expire August 31st, 2022. Now, that doesn't mean that you should wait until August the 30th to start the annual, because that would not be smart. But you've actually got the whole month of that month to, enjoy your flying that airplane for a little bit longer. Key aspects of this process is that the AME does what is set out by you, the owner, and shouldn't be doing anything above and beyond that. Based on the standard in Appendix B, there are a generic list of items to inspect. Typical intervals do not exceed 12 months. And there are other things that are applicable in Appendix C, items such as a compass, ELT, fire extinguisher, etc. Airworthiness Directive limitations must be respected, and the logbook entry using the standard in Appendix B or C should be followed. And let's not forget, too, that the AME or AMO that's doing the work needs to be appropriately rated to do the work that is required. All right, a little bit more work on this. Basic and intervals, CAR 625. So setting up the schedule for non-commercial aircraft is really a lot of work for you to do, right? We've said before, you can follow Cessna or Piper or Beech manufactured guidelines, but in many cases, using what's in the CARs, both Appendix B and Appendix C, will flesh out a schedule. And there are also other owner groups that can, if you've come across an airplane that you're not familiar with at all, you can use the advice of other owners groups to suggest what should be in the annual. And, trust your AME as well. His recommendations or her recommendations can be part of that. But ultimately, what you've set up needs to be appropriate, can be inspected or checked by transport. And if there is something you're missing, you do want to make sure that it gets pulled into line. Okay, so mandatory items, maintenance schedules. All aircraft except ultralight aircraft shall be maintained in accordance with the maintenance schedule. This kind of pulls it together. Or approved by the minister that complies with CAR 605 and Standard 625, which we've been talking about quite a bit here in the last few minutes, right? Out-of-phase tasks and equipment are part of that in Appendix C, and complying with Parts 1 and 2 of Appendix B and Appendix C is considered to be a suitable schedule and suitable for the minister. And if you have any doubts and you want to get a Transport Canada Civil Aviation perspective on things, by all means, reach out to one of those folks and say, hey, here's what I'm doing. What do you think? Right? And hopefully you'll get a good response from them as well. All right, Roger, I think it's your turn. And where there is airworthiness directives, sir.
Airworthiness directives, yes. And there can be all sorts of flavors of these directives. Some of these directives never go away. I've seen directives that are required, annual inspection of a particular bell crank assembly, or I guess a lot of the Cessna seat rail type things are an example of one of these types of ADs. Other ADs are cease and desist. We had a tailplane fall off an aircraft. It must be inspected before it goes flying. Fortunately, we don't see many of those, cease and desist type elements, but I have seen some that have been pretty serious and required a detailed inspection because there was a problem with the manufacturer for a particular range of serial numbers of an aircraft. So it really depends. And then you get these other flavors of ADs. And I'll use the Piper Pawnee as an example. Spray planes and uses a lot of towing and leave very rough lives. There was an AD that came out for inspecting the cluster welds where the struts join on the wing and also where the strut joins up at the fuselage. You know, Pawnee is a low wing strut on top. It's essentially a Piper Super Cub wing, but upside down. It's mounted down low. And those welds, those cluster welds would crack. And the AD was, I think it's every 2 years, you had to go and get it magnafluxed or dye penetrant test and things like that. It was a lot of work. There was then a SGC that came out for a revised weld assembly that you could buy for one time that basically canceled out that AD. So you had two paths to compliance. You could either keep taking the wings off and getting the struts magnafluxed and dye penetrant tested every 2 years, or bite the bullet and get the redesigned weld cluster to do it. I just highlight that as an example of, you know, compliance in a lot of cases can be a little different than just, you know, what you see on the surface. And for the most part, Transport Canada and the FAA do listen to what they call alternate forms of compliance on some of these ADs. Next slide, Peter.
Right on, sir.
So once the inspection is completed, you have to generate an aircraft maintenance release, which is a certification in the journey log and the technical log that says, you know, what type of work, like we said a few slides back, when it was done, who was done, to what standard, et cetera, et cetera. In the case of a privately owned aircraft, it could be an AME or an AMO. Peter had an excellent point that it has to make sure that you are an electrical AME if you're replacing a wiring harness and it's not just a metalwork AME. And your AME will be very vocal about what they can and cannot do based on the ratings that they have through that. However, if you were dealing in a commercial aircraft world, you're dealing with AMOs, and AMOs pretty well exclusively on all of this. But an AME, a knowledgeable AME, as a privately owned and privately maintained aircraft through this, can certainly perform a lot of these ADs. There are even some ADs, and we get into this more in section 3, that are really seem straightforward. I've seen ADs where it's replace page 56 and 57 of the POH, Pilot Operating Handbook, with these new documents. Well, that can be done. You can replace the page and make an entry and say, you know, page is replaced. So like I said, there's many different flavors. Read the ADs very carefully. A lot of them may not even apply to your aircraft. And we'll walk through some examples later on in the presentation. I pulled the active AD list for both my glider and also for my Champ, just as a comparison. Once the inspection is completed, as per CAR 571.10, you can use the appropriate wording through there. Whether it's owner maintenance, can go through it's the joy of owner maintenance. That is the perceived benefit of owner maintenance. I really would caution people not to take away from anybody's technical prowess, but having worked in the aerospace industry, having another set of eyes look at your aircraft versus the same person that's flying it day in, day out and be exclusively responsible for the maintenance and entries. I see huge value in having another set of eyes do it. And even the cars support that, because for most of you, if you've had any kind of control surface removed, a critical primary control surface, you realize that it needs 2 signatures to have it reinstalled and checked and signed out as airworthy, because we're human beings. And part of this is recognizing that for all the processes, all the checks, all the paperworks, we're still human. Things slip through, right? And another set of eyes will look at it and go, what's that? And I'm sure most of you who've any one of you have dealt a lot with your home-built aircraft and working with your local EAA chapter, you've heard this many times about, getting your assist, your builder assist, your sponsor going through to look at it again and have another set of eyes. So, although you may go for owner maintenance, please try to keep another set of eyes engaged, and ideally an AME engaged.
Okay. Very good advice, Roger. If you've got any air left in your lungs, how about sharing with us the concepts of elementary work?
Elementary work, yes. The 29 items that you can and can't do, right? You can change the oil. You can change your tires. As long as, and I have this hammered into me, right? As long as you're not opening a hydraulic line. You can do minor repairs to upholstery, elements like that. There's a well-defined list. I can, with my glider, which has automatic control hookups, I can take the wings off, put it in the trailer, drive it 100 miles, put the wings back on. I can do that myself as elementary maintenance, as long as I put an entry in the journey log that says, wings removed, wings attached, positive control check done. And we're very disciplined. We go above and beyond in a lot of cases. So you do have a lot of latitude. If you suspect you have fouled spark plugs, you can take the spark plugs out and clean them up and put them back in. Now, if you've never done that before, this is that relationship with your AME. And your AME will probably hug you. He'll charge you for showing you, but he'll probably give you a big hug for showing you how to sandblast the spark plugs and check them out, because he's probably tired up to here of doing it 50,000 times during his career. And if he can show you how it can do that and you can demonstrate to do that, hey, you're engaged, you know what's happening out. And then you actually can connect maybe the cause of those fouled plugs to saying, man, I have to pull them all out of that O200 again. Maybe I will actively try to lean my mixture more regularly instead of staying at full rich on that 2-hour cross country. Okay, so little examples like that are a great way to stay involved. So, go through, take a look at 625 Appendix A, and you can see what you're allowed to do. If you are unfamiliar, talk to your AME. How would you do this? What is the best practice? I'm thinking in particularly when it comes to spark plugs, re-annealing the copper washers that go through to put in. There's the devil's in the details. We're dealing with very reliable systems, but the devil's in the details. Re-annealing copper washer makes a big difference, right? And doing that properly and how to do that. So just because it's on the elementary maintenance list doesn't mean go ahead and do it. It just means you can, but your obligation to yourself and part of that contract for you staying alive and working with your AME is to learn about it. You might just be surprised, how much more you find out about your aircraft.
And it also makes a transition, I think, Roger, to helping out with annual inspections. A much more natural one, because you're already doing some of that in between annual inspection work. So you're now becoming more involved and more with the airplane.
Exactly. We'll talk so much more about that in October.
Yep. Okay, let's talk about, thank you so much so far, Roger. Awesome work. Let's talk about a little bit about maintenance releases. Roger's already started. We're going to just jump to upgrades as well, because oftentimes annual inspections, there may be a test flight involved. Who can sign off on that? The CARS tells us that 60585. Then there's also a requirement in 5710 that the AME can say it's required, but obviously the person who did the test flight is the person who signs off on it. What about upgrades? So as I said, sometimes annuals are that chance where you go, okay, I'm going to get some Farkles, I'm going to get some nice little doodads and add a a new Bluetooth connection or something like that. And these are the upgrades that tend to happen during annual inspections. So you might have those planned out. But what's it going to do to your C of A? Are they what are called supplementary type certificate upgrades? Does it even matter if the aircraft is amateur built or owner maintained? No, it probably doesn't. What about non-required safety enhancing equipment, which is called NORSI, right? That's what non-required safety enhancing equipment, the short form of that is NORSI. And that's a thing where it adds to the value and the flight safety of the aircraft. In fact, let me just jump this slide and we'll talk about NORSI. So it's a safety enhancement such as an angle of attack indicator or a panel mounted instrument that gives you a better awareness of what's going on in your engine. For instance, an engine cylinder head temperature gauge, which was never standard equipment on a 150, it might have been on a 172, but maybe you don't have it, or an exhaust gas temperature gauge. So if you're leaning that 150 like you should be all the time when you're cruising, this EGT gauge and cylinder head temperature gauge will give you a better insight into what's going on inside the engine. So one of the keys to NORSIs is that it has to be considered by your AME, the person signing off the work, that it is a minor modification. If it's a minor mod and your AME is willing to sign off on it, or the AME who can sign off is willing to do the work, perfect. It's a NORSI. If it's a major mod, then it better have an STC. Okay? We won't go there today. We'll just keep it in the NORSI world for right now. And there are great things that can enhance your safety awareness in your airplane, safety enhancements. All righty. Okay, we talked about abnormal events a little bit while ago. There are 23 different occurrences. And essentially, what is an abnormal occurrence? Basically, it's anything that would invalidate the certificate of airworthiness or exceed one of the aircraft manufacturer's specification or design limits for the aircraft. And typically we're talking about certified category airplanes. You know what? Could be as simple as an overweight takeoff or an overweight landing. If you take off overweight, you have had an abnormal event. You might not have planned it. You might have only realized it after you did a closer calculation afterwards, which you shouldn't have done, but you did, right? Or you were doing a steep turn and maybe you got a little too close to the red line airspeed, right? Prop strike, hard landing, they're all there. We're not going to talk about all of them today. We don't have time for it. But CAR 60588 talks about what they are. And in Appendix G of 625 are where they're listed out. And it's very straightforward. Right? Boom, boom, boom. This is an abnormal event. Okay? And if that happens, guess what? Now you have to log it in the journey log and you have to consult with your AME, who will have to then do an airworthiness inspection of the airplane to determine that the aircraft's airworthiness has not been compromised. And then the AME will sign off saying basically that the airworthiness was not compromised by this event, which then makes your airplane airworthy again. And your C of A is back in effect. Roger, over to you, sir, for parts.
Okay, Peter. Next slide there. Thank you. Parts, new parts. Well, if you have a type certified aircraft, only approved parts can be used on it. And a good indicator of those approved parts is whether or not it's got a green tag, or it may have some alternate forms, the TCCA Form 1, FAA Form, EASA Form 1. There should be some kind of form about its authorized release and certificate that will go in your technical log with it. Your AME will be looking for it. If you are in an owner-maintained aircraft, or I shouldn't say necessarily just that, but amateur-built aircraft or whatever, this comes into what is the value of your safety worth, right? Certainly, there might be some other equipment that are much more reliable, far better served in your situation. But I certainly would not recommend going to Canadian Tire to get, bolts, even for a small assembly necessarily. There's something to be said about the basics, staying with good, solid components, even though you may not be with a type certified aircraft. So look for the tags, look for the paperwork, be suspicious if you're getting something going on your type approved aircraft that doesn't have the appropriate release certificate for those parts. Okay, next slide. Used parts, they can be overhauled, they can be reworked. It happens all the time. Commercial aviation industry, retread tires, things like that. Hopefully we're not at that point with GA for the price of something as important as a tire or replacing tires. Buy new. That's a recommendation, but I'll get off that side. There's not a place to be looking for saving bucks, but it should have some form of a release certificate as well, indicating it's been overhauled, zero timed, call it what you will, parts. And there are a lot of companies out there that supply very valuable elements. Like, I live and breathe this with my Champ, because that old Continental A65, they haven't made the original cylinders for that engine for decades. Millennium has a cylinder kit, but you have to replace all of them. But, almost every cylinder, every part you get is overhauled, reworked, et cetera, and you still have the appropriate forms that come back with those cylinders. So nothing wrong with it, but the advisory circular can really help you with your guidance, the 571-024. Another one I'd recommend you take a read, particularly if you're flying an older aircraft, where there may be no new parts available and only reworked or overhauled. Next slide.
Yeah, Roger. And one of the things we do want to say just before we go and move on to our next slide is that all this paperwork, all these green cards, these green tags need to end up somewhere. It's not like Christmas morning where you open up the box and you throw away the wrapping. Far from it, right? Those green tags need to go, Roger, where?
The technical logbook.
Yeah.
Yes. And sometimes they'll be stapled to pages, and sometimes they'll be put in the pouch at the back, but it depends on your AME. But put them in there. Do not throw them away, like Peter said. Oh, geez. That's what you're paying for.
Okay, Roger. ELTs.
ELTs. So we'll talk two different hats here, because, and I'll stick strictly for GA aircraft. On commercial, we've got a little bit of a reprieve. We have until 2025, I believe it is. It was 5 years from 2020, yep. Right, Peter?
November 2025 to be precise.
Where we can then, after 2025, we can take all those 121.5 ELTs and use them as boat anchors for our fishing boats or whatever else we want to do, because they are no longer legal for the aircraft. Until then, you have to do a performance and corrosion check every 12 months on those ELTs for the 121.5. And there's lots of avionics shops. They know what to do. You probably have your favorite shop to do this stuff with, but that's a 12-month requirement. In the case of the 406s, for those of you enlightened souls that have already gone ahead and gone with the 406 ELT, you can do self-test on aircraft. A lot of these ELTs have some kind of a self-test feature. I'll say, please consult your manuals for that, and it'll say it's particular to that model of ELT. There isn't like a universal standard on the 406s, but the self-tests may enable the 121.5 as well with some units, may not if it doesn't have 121.5. Consult the manual that you have with your 406. And every 24 months, need to do a performance corrosion check. The big difference between an operational test and a performance test, operational test or self-test, can be done in the aircraft. The old rule on the 121.5s, 5 minutes, within 5 minutes past the hour, every hour. You can do that. There is no live testing allowed for the 406 beyond the self-test, unless you want to get some very irate phone calls from the Joint Rescue Coordination Center in Trenton or whatever region you're in. But there is a process with the manual documentation on those elements for that. A performance test requires a removal. So, and going to your AME and electrical AME and going through. There we go. That's the one. So, operational testing, performance testing. And then the third dynamic you've got is the scheduled maintenance. And this is things like the batteries. So independent of the 12 months, the 24 months with the 406, or the 12-month interval on the 121.5s, your batteries may be good for a year, 3 years, 2 years, depends on the manufacturer of the ELT. So I hate to say it's a bit of a dog's breakfast, but you really have to understand the subtleties of your ELT, what type it is, what the manufacturer is, what the battery cycle is. And if you were a wise consumer with your 406, I know I'm already looking ahead and, not to decide what 406. You got to look at all three. You may wind up getting the cheapest 406 ELT, but the battery may need to be replaced every 12 months. Not necessarily a good value, but you may also find another 406 ELT that the battery has got a 3-year period or a 2-year period, and the price of the replacement batteries might be different. So there's a matrix there of trade studies and reliability and size and ease of installation and use. Stuff to keep in mind if you haven't already made the plunge, but it isn't just on the surface of get me a 406 ELT. You have to understand the maintenance requirements on this, and if for no other reason is that it could affect your pocketbook. Okay, let's cut right to the chase, right? They say general aviation pilots, we're cheap buggers, right? We're cheap buggers by nature, but there's some things, you just want to take a look at and just do it right? So take the time and put the entries in there. Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
No, you're doing a fantastic job, Roger. One of the questions that we do have is, can I fly when the ELT has been removed for maintenance? And I know you know the answer to this.
Yeah.
And the answer is?
You can. But like any other inoperable piece of equipment, you have to tag it out, okay? So you need to put a sticker, a decal, a card, whatever it is, wherever that element is, and says this ELT has been removed for service on the date, et cetera, et cetera. Should also go in the journey log as well, that it's been removed. And I believe you have 30 days, right, Peter, if I remember correctly?
Right. Yeah, you've got 30 days to get it back into the airplane. That's right.
Yeah.
So there we are, folks. That's the end of part 1. Hopefully we generated many thoughts in your heads. We'll be hopping into part 2 in a few moments. Roger and I are going to just take a bit of a bio break while I think Adrian and Andrea take over the show.
Yes, Peter, Roger, that was fantastic. You're definitely doing a great job in highlighting how it's in our best interest to get very much involved in the aircraft maintenance journey. So with that, we have Adrian Tegler here from ForeFlight. He's a senior member of the technical support team at ForeFlight to walk us through some very complimentary information on aircraft maintenance. And so this is a great opportunity. If you have any general questions for ForeFlight, if we aren't able to answer them here today, I'll send those over to Adrian and to the team afterwards. So Adrian, I welcome you on stage to share a little bit more about your background and to go ahead and share your screen if you'd like to.
All right, thanks, Sharon. Thanks so much for having me, and I will just share my screen here. All right, is that coming up for you guys okay?
That looks great, Adrian.
All right, perfect. Okay, so thank you once again for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to you guys there for the first part. That was great, kind of following on. I'm learning kind of a ton as we go through this, making me want to be an aircraft owner as well. All right, so I'm going to jump right in. So as Sharon mentioned, my name's Adrian Tegler. I've been part of the ForeFlight pilot support team for 9 years now, and I'm also a Canadian pilot and flown for a Canadian airline here. So yeah, let's jump in here. So today's topics, we're going to go over, I'm going to give you a new feature highlight that I think is pretty cool. We're going to talk about ForeFlight checklist. We're going to look at weight and balance in ForeFlight. And I'm going to give you some information on maintenance tracking in ForeFlight Logbook. And then after that, we will jump into Q&A. So I'm going to try to tie this and relate it back to the seminar as much as possible. There's so much kind of important information in terms of safety here. And I'm going to try to show you ways that you can kind of implement and use the features in ForeFlight to kind of complement what we're talking about in the seminar today. All right, so we'll jump into this new feature highlight that you may or may not have seen yet in ForeFlight. And it's our new obstacles in 3D view. So as you can see there on the iPad screen, this is a nice view looking at Toronto Island. Flown in here many times, but if it's your first time flying into Toronto Island Airport, this is a great way to take a look at the obstacles that you may encounter, or that you'll be near at least as you plan your flight into Toronto Island. So yeah, it's a great way to identify any hazards. You get a mental picture of the final approach for the different runways with regards to the obstacles that are around. So this is available in ForeFlight Performance Plus subscriptions. All the 3D features are part of ForeFlight Performance Plus. And this view also, you can see that there's traffic, so you can kind of even see the traffic coming in there. And you can get some good situational awareness if you may be flying into an airport like Toronto City, Billy Bishop for the first time. This is another view kind of coming in for runway 26 into Toronto Island. And it shows when you're in a route preview mode here in the 3D view, it's giving you even more kind of awareness. So it's actually highlighting the obstacles with regards to your route, and it's showing anything within 1,000 feet of your altitude and your descent profile here for final in yellow. So you can see here, there's the two stacks. I have lots of experience with this flying and landing on runway 26. You actually come pretty close to, especially the second stack there. And it's great to be able to see this beforehand, so you're kind of ready for it and you can look for it. Even if it's a VFR flight, it's definitely, it's still kind of on that approach for runway 26. So it's nice to have that information beforehand, and you can see the two stacks as well as the city. And anything, any obstacles, buildings or towers or windmills or anything that's there, that's from 100 feet of your altitude and higher is red. So that's it's the classic kind of altitude red and yellow colors for hazard avoidance that all the manufacturers kind of use. So that's the highlight there on 3D obstacles in ForeFlight. So let's jump into checklist. So checklist, of course, is a crucial aviation safety tool. And we're talking a lot about safety today, and ForeFlight checklists can be implemented into so many different ways. So if you haven't used it, it's got a great intuitive interface. There's quite a few integrated templates for checklists. There's a checklist speak option that we'll talk a little bit about here. We have emergency checklists. You can customize the checklists, you can share them. And I'll talk a little bit about creating unique checklists for different applications. So ForeFlight has flexible built-in checklist templates. So these are derived right from the POH from different aircraft. And you can just quickly choose your aircraft in the list. And it has that's a nice starting point. It may be everything that you need for that aircraft, or if you want to, you can add your own checklist items. You can edit the checklist, but it's a great starting point, and it makes the process a lot quicker for creating a checklist. Checklist Speak's a fantastic feature. So no Copilot, no problem, right? You can actually use ForeFlight's checklist to just read out the checklist items for you. And I've used this in flight. It works great. It works even better if you have a headset that's connected either via a wired connection to your iPad or a Bluetooth connection, if your headset supports that. And then you have the checklist read out right in your headset, which is perfect. And you can just select speak. You can choose the speed at which it speaks the checklist items, and it will just read through your checklist for you. And you can go through those items. So it's, I've flown in the airline environment, and when you have a captain, first officer kind of scenario, you'll read checklists back and forth, and someone will read and then someone will do and say check. And it's very similar to that kind of environment. And it's a great way to go through a checklist. So that's one option. You can also manually check through the checklist without having it read, but it's nice to have it spoken. So emergency checklists, you can quickly jump to your emergency checklist, tapping on that red button there at the top, and that will bring you to quickly to the checklist. So it's going to save you time. It would spare you any hassle of kind of flipping through your paper in a time critical scenario. So it's nice to have that that's always there, that button, and you can just go quickly to your emergency checklists. So customize and share. ForeFlight provides the option for you to customize any checklist and then share it. So here I've got my buddy Tom Cruise. He flies a P-51 Mustang, lucky guy. And so I've created a checklist for him here, and I'm emailing it to him. So you can create checklists, you can email them, and then he can just open it up in ForeFlight, and he's got the checklist there. So quick and easy. You can also use AirDrop or different methods like that to share checklists. All right, so unique checklists. ForeFlight has supplied I'm Safe checklist, excuse me. And so you can use that checklist, which is always a great, thing just to go through before the flight. Use it and make sure you've checked all those items before, and that you're ready to fly. You can take that a step further and create your own checklists. I've seen checklists that go through items like all the required documents on board. Do I have my pilot and my radio license? Do I have the charts that I need, the current versions of the charts that I need? If you've got ForeFlight, you should have all that downloaded. Have I checked the weather? Is the weight and balance complete for the flight? So you can create your own checklist to meet your needs, and really the sky's the limit, or it's not the limit, and you can really use this feature to make yourself a lot safer pilot. You can use these checklists for maintenance items. We're talking a lot about aircraft maintenance today, and it's a great way to use it also for aircraft maintenance, or any items that you might want to have a checklist for. Okay, so let's get into weight and balance. We were talking a little bit about that earlier as well today. So ForeFlight has a weight and balance feature built into the app, and it's available with all subscriptions. So you've hopefully seen it if you're using ForeFlight. And I'm just going to quickly run through how to create a new weight and balance profile. And I want to give you a tip, just as a Canadian pilot myself. There's a kind of a good tip that we can use as Canadian pilots to enter a new aircraft profile into weight and balance. So the way that ForeFlight's pre-configured weight and balance profiles work is they are based on N numbers, so US registered N numbers, and that will quickly load all the information for the weight and balance, or most of it. You can always just start from scratch, and that's totally fine. But if you want to kind of preload some of the information for your aircraft profile, what you can do is enter a a US registered N number, and it will load that information. So I recommend using Google, and just do a quick Google image search for, in this case, Cessna 172P, and it provides an N number. I can then enter that into ForeFlight, and it will populate the weight and balance profile for a Cessna 172P. I can then enter, change the registration to my Canadian registration. I can confirm, I'm going to enter my basic empty weight and CG for my aircraft. I can confirm the numbers, work with the POH. But this is just a quick way to get a preloaded profile, and it's just based on a US database for aircraft type data certificates that are use N numbers. So that's kind of a way to make it work for us here in Canada. All right, so I'm going to skip this slide. It's just showing setting up a new weight and balance profile. And if you have any questions on this, just for time's sake, I'm going to jump over this one, but please send an email to team@foreflight.com with any questions. There's a weight and balance guide you can get in the documents page as well in ForeFlight. So you can look that up, and if you have any issues creating a profile. So I want to cover, since we're talking about aircraft maintenance, I want to cover a tip for maintenance tracking in ForeFlight Logbook, which is kind of a nice little item that you can use ForeFlight Logbook for. So ForeFlight Logbook, again, available in all subscriptions, all of our standard subscriptions plus subscriptions that we have available, Basic Plus, Pro Plus, and Performance Plus. And you have an option under qualifications to create a certificate, and you can use the certificate to track maintenance items. And I've seen many pilots do this. I've done this myself. It's great for, putting in oil changes and annuals and, pedostatic checks, et cetera, anything that you might want to track. So you're simply going to tap the plus button at the top under the Logbook qualifications page. You can enter a title for the certificate. So annual inspection in this case. If you want to enter some type of a number associated with the annual, you can do that, or your aircraft registration. You can enter the date that it was done, and you can enter an expiry date. You can enter any notes in the limitation section. So I'm just going to put that the annual is completed by, and the company who did the annual, I'm just going to enter their name in there. So you can enter any notes in there. You can add any photos if you want to. So I might take a photo from the journey log or wherever the annual was entered. You can add those photos so that they're stored with your logbook. You can view the photos here as I'm doing, and it's all part of the certificate. And then I just tap done, and it's saved. So that's a way to track maintenance items in ForeFlight Logbook. All right, so I'm just about kind of at my time here. Again, as I had mentioned previously there, if you have any questions on these things today, this is just a quick little overview. Please email team@foreflight.com, and we're all pilots on the team, and I'm always happy to help with any questions that you have. Other useful resources, always Pilot's Guide, available in ForeFlight and online. And ForeFlight has a good video series and lots of different videos you can look up as well. All right, with that, we can open it up to some Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adrian. Really helpful information, especially on the maintenance logging. I think this is a bit of maybe a divisive topic in general of paper-based versus digital, but thinking of those who may have significant flight experience or are starting to transition over, how does ForeFlight keep that in mind? I think the weight and balance, you have the function, you have print capabilities, and with your logbook, I think there's like a catch-up function that you can use?
Yeah, for sure. So it is a bit daunting for those pilots that have, paper logbooks with, possibly thousands of hours and thousands of entries, and they're thinking about going digital, and it sounds like, kind of this horrible task of entering all this information digitally now. And so we do recommend catch-up entry in those cases. So what you can do in ForeFlight Logbook is make one entry that kind of catches, either all your hours. You can just start with a general catch-all entry. If you want to break it up into, I've seen pilots enter an entry for their single engine time if they're flying both, and then another one for their multi-engine time. So catch up, for that, and it's got the total hours for that. So there's a lot of options that make it less daunting to bring your paper logbook into digital. And I did it. I had a fully paper logbook with thousands of hours, and when ForeFlight came out with their logbook feature, I brought it all over, and I can tell you it's worth the bit of work that it takes to bring it over. It's so nice to have it there digitally. I can connect my logbook entry with a track log that I might have recorded, with photos from the flight in ForeFlight Logbook. It's such a great way to kind of take your logbook to a new level that you can do so much more with than I could ever have done with paper.
That's a good amount of information there, and good to hear that you yourself made that transition over and found a lot of value in that. We have a question here of whether or not that digital maintenance recording has any legal weight. Would you have an answer to that?
No. So I think it would be similar to if you were, it's a way for personal tracking. I'm not sure about the legality if you were to write, for tracking purposes in a paper logbook, for example.
We're not there yet, but it's definitely always good to have a backup.
Okay, very good. Maybe we should take a step back for those who are considering using a tool like ForeFlight of your main features or functionalities, and then afterwards maybe we can touch upon even the device type to use, preference of iPad model or tablet in general.
Yes. Okay. So question was just recommendations on device type, right? And then, sorry, was there a second part or the first part of that?
The main highlights of ForeFlight for anyone who hasn't used it before. We have a good chunk of folks in our audience today who are just considering it in general.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So if you haven't used ForeFlight before, it's kind of like your one-stop shop for everything that you probably need in terms of your charts for the flight, checking your weather, filing your flight plan, your logbook, your checklist, any type of all the Canadian information is in there, from the CFS to the Canadian Water or Aerodrome Supplement to the VNC and the VTA. All your IFR charts are there, the CAP. So it's going to include everything that you need. It's always going to update with the current information. It has a lot of great situational awareness features built in, so you see yourself on the moving map and you might see obstacles. Great way to kind of look at, in 3D at new airports that you might fly into to get situational awareness. So there's really a lot there, and I really recommend downloading ForeFlight from the Apple App Store. If you have an iPad or an iPhone, it automatically comes with a 30-day free trial, so you can just give it a try and start to dig into those features. I don't have enough time to kind of go through them all here today, but start taking a look at it. And that brings me kind of into devices. So ForeFlight runs on iPad and iPhone. So you need to have one of those devices to use it. And so you can get it, as I said, from the Apple App Store. In terms of devices, there's a bit of personal preference there. We have a lot of pilots that really love the iPad mini. And there's been a lot of excitement because Apple just released just is going to be releasing soon the new Apple Mini. that's going to be perfect for running ForeFlight. So we recommend one of the newer devices for sure. So a newer iPad or a newer iPhone, just to get the best experience out of ForeFlight and to run it as smoothly, and just to have kind of be able to run all the features that are available. So a newer device, newer iPad. If you have the space in your airplane and you can use a full-size iPad. Some people just use their iPhone, and all the features are pretty much available between iPad, iPhone, and iPad mini. So it comes down to personal preference. The one tip is to use or purchase, if you have not already, a Wi-Fi plus cellular model iPad. So even if you don't plan to use the data on your iPad, you don't even need to have a SIM card in the iPad. But that is the model of iPad that Apple installs the GPS receiver in. Yeah. So that's the model that will allow you to see your position on the charts and on the approach plates and on the taxiway diagrams. If you don't have that model, you do need to connect your iPad with an external GPS receiver. So that's the option there if you don't have the Wi-Fi plus cellular iPad.
Okay, that was a lot of great information. I hope it's helpful for anyone out there. Just a quick check. Can you hear my mic all right, Adrian?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Yep, that's great.
2 more questions and then let you kind of get on with the rest of your weekend here. Just very much appreciate your time. I think I know the answer to this, but there is a question on whether or not ForeFlight works and shows ADS-B traffic.
Yes, so ForeFlight can show ADS-B traffic if it's connected to an ADS-B receiver. So ForeFlight supports pretty much all of the available ADS-B receivers that are out there. So that may be a Sentry or a Stratus. It may be one of the Garmin ADS-B receivers can work with ForeFlight, and there's a whole range of those. So you can ask the team at ForeFlight if you have any specific questions on a Garmin receiver. There's quite a few, but if you have that receiver connected to your iPad, ForeFlight will be able to display ADS-B traffic. Just keep in mind, in Canada, we don't have a ground-based ADS-B tower network. So the traffic, you're not going to get a full traffic picture when you're flying in Canada in terms of ADS-B traffic. You're going to get direct broadcast ADS-B traffic from primarily airliners and any aircraft that are broadcasting their ADS-B traffic signal directly. But because we don't have that tower network, ground-based tower network that the US does, we don't get the full ADS-B traffic picture in Canada.
Okay, awesome. And just a quick question here to end things off. There was a comment here of a great way to start with ForeFlight is through the videos as a way to get familiar with the tool. Is there a specific video that you recommend to our group here today to view if they are interested in learning more?
There's, and I'm just trying to think of the specific name of it, but we have a kind of like a 101 and a 202 kind of course. So you can look for those ones. Like it's a ForeFlight, kind of initial overview kind of course or video. And then there's the second kind of more advanced version. So those two are great. I would say just go through the videos, and if there's like a feature that interests you, click on it and take a look, and just go from there. They're all good.
Awesome. A lot of video content, whether through the safety program with COPA or through our sponsor ForeFlight. So thank you very much for all that good information here today, Adrian. Appreciate your time. And we'll jump back into part 2 of the seminar here today. Yes. Cheers. Thanks
so much for having me, Sharon, and for Peter and Roger.
Thanks,
fantastic. It's been great to listen to all you guys have to say, all the knowledge you're sharing. So thanks.
Thanks, Adrian.
Pleasure. All right, here we go. So part 1's over. Part 2 is about to begin. I'm going to turn the mic back over to Roger. So we're kind of jumping gears in a big way here. We just spent a good amount of time talking about everything that we need to know about making sure that our airplane is serviceable, and that our annual inspection and our STCs and elementary work and all that stuff was done right. So now we're jumping and we're saying, okay, assuming that all the scheduled maintenance is up to date, what do we need to have on board when we go fly? Roger, over to you.
Yeah, and thanks, Peter. And this is probably the biggest leap when the rubber hits the road or rubber hits the runway, is the difference between going to your local flying club and renting an aircraft and maintaining and owning your own aircraft. You go to a local flying club, probably renting a commercially, hopefully you're renting a commercially registered and maintained aircraft, where a lot of this stuff is done. There'll be a POH, all the placards and markings will be done. The equipment that's needed to fly is there. The aircraft will not be dispatched to you to rent unless, you know, the MELs are in compliance. Day VFR over the top. If you're going to get the aircraft dispatched, the dispatcher won't let you fly if it's dark out and it's not got all the equipment for night VFR or IFR. So, you know, we kind of grow up in a very cuddled environment, which is justifiably so, because, you know, when we start our flight training, we're worried about learning to fly the aircraft and, you know, passing exams and written exams and flight tests and everything. Now you own this horse, this aircraft, this machine, and we have to go through and say, oh, could I really go? Is this in compliance with a privately maintained, privately registered, non-commercial aircraft? And does it work that way? So a lot of interesting topics here as we go ahead. Next slide, Peter. So a POH or AFM, or some of the airline folks will call it different things. I get teased all the time by a lot of our retired Air Canada captains at the gliding club and at the power club I fly at Smiths Falls. But we'll call it a POH. It's got to be the POH authorized by the manufacturer. It's tied to that particular model of an aircraft. A POH for a, you know, D model 172 is not legally applicable to a POH that to throw into an M model 172 or a P. They're different, subtle differences, but certainly when you get into the newer generation, things like the 172, very different. So you've got to have it for the right aircraft. It has to contain all the amendments and supplementary material. I talked about ADs as being a vehicle to include amendments or supplementary data that may change due to various incidents. So there may be amendments that have to be up to date. There should be a change page. A good idea if you've got a legitimate POH is take a look and see if there's a change page at the front end of it. A lot of times if you have to update the POH, you've got to put an updated page for the change page. And it has to be available to all crew members at their duty stations. You got to have it available. It could be electronic, it could be paper. As long as it's tied to that aircraft, that model, and it is up to date and current with the appropriate amendments. Over to you, Peter.
Well said, sir. Yep, thank you, Roger. So, keeping on this theme about what do we need to go flying, there's a CARS that talks about, CARS 60505, that talks about markings and placards. Again, I ask the question, what the hell are we talking about? What is markings? What are placards? Well, markings are all those fancy things on the instruments that, you know, tell you where the red line is, tell you where the white line is, the blue line, the yellow line, all those things, right? So all aircraft cockpit markings in accordance with the aircraft manufacturer's original markings for the airplane. So if you've got a 50-year-old airplane, which you probably do, or maybe even older, are all the instruments in the right spot? Are they all in accordance with what the aircraft manufactured back then? And if they're not, is there something in the books for the airplane that says that, hey, this altimeter or this airspeed indicator replaces the one that came with the aircraft manufacturer originally? The second part of that on placards is we're not talking about protest signs, right? We're talking about unserviceable or removed items that must be placarded or made so it's very obvious to the pilot when he or she gets in the airplane is that, it's like the microphone. Does this work? Does that radio work? Does this VSI work? Does this EGT gauge work? And if it's not working, there has to be a sign saying, by the way, this gauge doesn't work. Or it has to be removed. And then, of course, the removed item must, where there's now nothing, needs to have a little placard saying VSI removed or EGT removed, right? In accordance with what was supposed to be in the aircraft originally. So this is all part of that continuing airworthiness thing, right? That goes on with the life of the airplane. All right. So what do the cars say about aircraft equipment serviceability? Well, it's pretty simple. 60506 says the aircraft cannot take off unless the required equipment is on board and is serviceable and is functioning normally. Interesting that it's prior to takeoff. Now, if something breaks during the flight, it breaks during flight. But prior to takeoff, all that stuff that is supposed to be there and functioning normally has to be working. If it isn't working, well, we'll jump back a slide. Has it been placarded, right? If it hasn't been placarded and it's not working, guess what? We're not airworthy. More on that later. Roger, how about you talking about MELs, my brother?
You bet. Okay, MELs, minimum equipment lists. Like the slide says, for most of the GA aircraft we fly, we usually don't have a list of items that may be unserviceable. Of course, the more sophisticated you get with an aircraft or platform, you'll probably have more of that. I keep being reminded that if most people knew what list of unserviceable items were on every aircraft you fly with any airline, you'd probably be jaw-dropped, but they're built to different standards with triple or quadruple or double redundancy in a lot of cases, and it's quite acceptable to do that. However, if your airspeed indicator isn't working in your Cherokee, that's kind of a go, no-go item right there off the top. So basically, we have a minimum equipment list that is required for day VFR, for night VFR, for IFR as well, VFR over the top. They're all different lists, and it's dynamic. And then you get subtleties, as we're probably all aware of, and I'll jump at the night equipment list where, you have to have a landing light if you're carrying a passenger, right? But you don't if you're flying by yourself. So you get these little quirks in the regulations back and forth that are useful to know what the limitations are. Now, I'll put a caveat on this whole thing. Just because legally it says you can fly if certain pieces of equipment aren't functional, you are the pilot in command. You know your skills, you know your ability, you know your comfort zone. And if you are not comfortable with flying that with that particular piece of equipment that is not serviceable, and I'll draw on the landing light example for nighttime. Legally, it says, no, if you got a burnt out landing light, yeah, go ahead and practice those circuits. But if you are not comfortable, the airmanship side of you should be saying, no, that's a deal breaker for me. So please, use what Peter and I will be talking about here in the next few slides as that's your minimum threshold. But your personal thresholds might be a little bit higher, hopefully a little higher, certainly not lower, but hopefully a little bit higher. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that from an airmanship perspective. Okay. So anyway, do I still got this? I think.
Yes, you do.
Dave. Yeah. So day VFR. There's a subtlety with day VFR, and it's really driven around the altimeter. And you'll hear the term a sensitive altimeter versus a crass or insensitive altimeter. No, I'm just joking. But, is required. And it says a sensitive altimeter is required in controlled airspace, right? And, we know what controlled airspace is, Class C, Class E. So, that's one thing, again, another little subtlety that you'll go back around through. If you're flying your Tiger Moth at 1,500 or 2,000 feet around an uncontrolled airspace away from everything, you may have a slightly different requirement that goes through this. But more importantly, is a typical scenario is you jump out and you start up the plane, and then you notice that your oil temperature gauge isn't registering, and you've been going through run-ups and everything else, and you're about to taxi out, and it's still down at 0, or it's way up at the high end. Either way, it's not a good story. And you sit there and go, I don't need that. Sorry, it's absolutely crucial. And the inner air person in yourself should be screaming to you, saying, I'm about to take off in an air-cooled, let's assume it's like Lycoming, a Continental engine, in an air-cooled engine, and I do not know what the temperature of the lifeblood of that oil is. All I know is the pressure, right? It should rub you the wrong way, regardless of the regulations, that you are in the dark, and literally in the dark as to the performance of that engine. So no different than not dipping the tanks and knowing for sure and trusting a little gauge. It should make you uneasy that you haven't dipped the tank or elements like that. So
right on, sir.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah. Okay. Let's just take it a little bit farther, and VFR over the top, which is a specialized sort of a little bit of VFR, a little bit of IFR. So everything that we saw on the previous slide is needed, but we also need a pitot heat system, hopefully, because maybe you're just going to brush through a little bit of cloud, maybe, right? Not a ceiling, but maybe a little bit of cloud. You must have a gyro heading indicator, or what's called a stabilized magnetic direction indicator, which is kind of an interesting one. A turn coordinator or a turn and slip indication system, and the appropriate radio communications and navigation equipment that can be used on appropriate frequencies for your travel through what is probably involving at least some controlled airspace. Moving on, let's look at night VFR, another derivation of VFR, right? So again, all of the equipment in the previous two slides, an adequate electrical source for all of the electrical instruments like cockpit lighting, aircraft lighting, landing lights, and fuses are required and spare fuses. And the trick question, which I'm not going to ask, I'll give the answer, is what is the number of fuses required if your aircraft has fuses versus circuit breakers? And the answer is 50%, okay? So if you've got 10 fused systems in your airplane, you need to have at least 5 of the appropriate fuses on board when you go flying at night, okay? So you can change fuses in the air.
Peter?
Yep.
I'll chime in with just a little tidbit on fuses.
Sure.
Yeah. One thing, and this will be particular for home builders to be aware of, you'll sit there and say, or maybe I've taken my aircraft to owner maintenance, I'm going to replace all those ancient fuses with circuit breakers, right? People go, yeah, circuit breakers, you can pull them in and out, don't have to carry the fuses, everything. Be aware that generally speaking, the lower current circuit breakers, i.e. 5 amps, 2 amps, those little things for the very small electronics, if you're replacing a fuse with the circuit breaker, the internal resistance of that circuit breaker is generally much, much, much higher than a fuse. So, this is a case of, it may seem to be simple. It's a very maybe overwhelming element to say in the cars about spare fuses and using fuses and all that. but there's a reason that things aren't just a cut and place, because I've seen many stories where people replace a fuse panel or get the AME to try to replace it, put a new breaker in, and the voltage drop is massive, and then the avionics that they're powering doesn't work right. So I just throw that little tidbit out there.
Okay. Well,
everything is interrelated, right?
There you go. So don't refuse your fuse. Okay, cool. A means of illumination for all instruments used to operate the aircraft. Could be a headlamp, right? Lighting light, as Roger said, position and anti-collision lights, and surprise, surprise, an outside air temperature gauge. First time that has shown up. And one last type of flying, IFR, Instrument Flight Rule 60518. So all the equipment we've seen, we've been building and building and building and building and building. We need to have a power failure warning for our vacuum-driven instruments. Some kind of gauge that says, oh, by the way, tap, 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 hello, you just lost your vacuum pump. Because if you're flying IFR and you're obviously now in instrument meteorological conditions, if you have no artificial horizon or directional gyro, life could get really, really, really interesting. An alternate static source for your altimeter and your pitot-static system. If you're in day VFR, you do not need position or anti-collision lights. Interesting. But for night IFR, it's the same as night VFR. Radio and comms and nav equipment, of course, as applicable for the whole route and destination, including your alternate. That, you know, there's no point going somewhere that you can't talk to people or do an approach there when you get there. All right, so that is the different types of categories. So I'm going to turn over now to Roger, and we're going to talk about snag detection and the next steps.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So part of the recognition of snag detection is that not everything is perfect, including a machine. Heaven forbid, right? So if you have a good relationship with your AME, coming back to our theme of your partnership with your AME, you will know the weak areas of your aircraft, the areas that your AME has that kind of aircraft whisperer second sense that knows where to look and says, this is typically a problem on Pipers. This is a problem on Moonies. This is a problem on even Van's aircraft for that matter, right? And they almost can sense it. You know, the AMEs that I know and really trust, it's unbelievable that 5 minutes, 10 minutes, they'll go in, they'll find something and they'll say, it's not broken. It doesn't look like it's failed, but keep an eye on this. Okay. And those are the areas when you do your walk around, you should be looking very closely at that. You know, any Cessna that has electrically operated flaps, check the tracks, check the mechanism, right? Because, you know, for better or for worse, that seems to be a regular item, you know, particularly on heavy use Cessnas, that, you know, the flaps may hang up or something like that, right? You're going to have snags. You're going to have these things that go, you know, the dome light inside the cockpit, the passenger compartment isn't working, or it's intermittent. And things like that. Document them. Put them in the journey log. Make it a matter of record, one way or another, through that. And it stays there. And I'll guarantee you that when it comes annual time, if you're dealing with a really good, reputable AME, he'll probably have a list of things of, gotta get this fixed now. And then he'll say, probably in the next 6 months or 12 months, keep a watch on these items. They're not unserviceable now. There's no indication, but keep an eye on those items. And watching then snags and seeing what snags are in the journey log helps you and helps the AME almost with a little bit of the preventative maintenance or elements looking forward and saying, for some reason, you know, the flap tracks on the port side of your 172 wear or come up to problems, you know, almost every 6 months or a year, but the right side's okay. Is something not in alignment or something? It could point to a bigger problem. So more records you can keep, the more detail you can keep. You're not keeping detail to keep Transport Canada happy. You're keeping detail because you want to see any long-term trends that are happening with your aircraft or elements to that too. Okay. Next slide.
Right on. Just one other thought there before we jump is that, it could be a recurring defect. And the recurring defect defined by Transport Canada Standard 72605 is if it repeats itself 3 times in the last 15 flight cycles. If it's outside that, then it's not recurring. If it's inside that, then it is recurring and maybe requires more attention.
Yeah. So carrying on here with our master equipment list and checklist, a lot of people will default to Transport Canada MEL, for what you need, whether you're flying day VFR, night VFR, whatever the case may be. That should be your MEL that you follow. If you've got a much more sophisticated aircraft, you get into different layers. There may be some unusual MEL items. If it's retractable gear, if it's got some unique avionics suite or some unique flap and slat driven elements, you can see very quickly why checklists and everything and go, no go items when you get into, bigger airline type aircraft and commercial aircraft like that can be very complex and sophisticated in terms of, working through the maze of whether it's a go, no go item. Through all of these aspects of that. Yep. So,
right on, Roger. One of the things too that we should probably think about just before we jump into this is that as we get into more electronically powered cockpits, and I'm thinking things like EFBs and that, there was a day when we didn't even want or need cigarette lighters, but they have been kind of a default for things like USB power connections. And if you are using electronic flight books and things like that, it could be that you've got a personalized MEL that says, hey, I'm going along cross country. I need at least 2 reliable sources for power for my EFBs while I'm flying, right? And so just because your airplane doesn't have an equipment list that you want when you go flying, that doesn't mean that you can't build one for yourself. Back to you, sir.
It's an excellent point, Peter. And I'll give an example with ForeFlight. I use ForeFlight and I have it on my iPad, but I will not go flying and I will not leave with my flight bag unless I got my spare battery that I can plug my iPad into. Just lock, stock, barrel. I got a little thin thing, I think from Sporty's, got it. And that's part of my go, no go criteria, along with my headlight. Because whether or not I'm flying, night or day, I keep a flashlight and headlight in my flight bag. Just becomes a way forward. So, a checklist, if we walk through, Peter, and, we'll take a look and say, do you see anything that is inoperative or equipment? Is this a new defect? One of the things you should do is take a look at the journey logs. Just take a span through it. It's good practice. See what's happening. See the last time it had maintenance done. What I like about looking at the journey logs, and I'll do this at Smiths Falls at the FTU, I'll flip through and see. And if I'm a suspicious person by nature when it comes to, anything maintenance or engineering wise. If I see the plane has just come out of a 50-hour inspection from its cycle, I usually go, okay. If I'm the first person or second person flying it, I'll go, because there will be some kind of infant mortality defect will likely pop out at that point. And it should put you on edge versus something that has gone on, maybe has 10 or 15 flights. Not that you let your guard down, but just, okay, work's been done. Not to digress, but if you read any of Mike Bush's books on aircraft maintenance, he has a very interesting philosophy about, sometimes leaving some elements that are critical elements, unless they are showing signs of wear, can induce more faults. So you want to take a look at what the trends are in the books there. Is it minimum equipment list or not? If it isn't, yes, you can go flying if it meets your requirements list. That's as right. A pilot and airmanship, right?
That's right. We're actually at Sharon's suggestion. We're going to take a brief pause at 1:30 in about a minute from now.
Okay.
So what we'll do is we'll leave this slide up, let people look at it. The key to this whole pilot decision-making checklist that we've introduced here today, it does have the sanction of Transport Canada. It's not fully developed, but what we're trying to do is helping us, we pilots, get through a decision-making process that steers us away from avoiding dealing with the issue of minor defects and snags in airplanes, right? So we'll just leave it at that. We'll just pause. We're just gonna, I'm not sure, are we gonna go off screen for 5 or what exactly, but we do want to take a 5-minute break.
Yes, I'll put on the slides earlier on the insurance incentives for those who wanted to more on it.
Okay. All right, we'll go off camera and off mic for the next 5.
Hey folks, I see a few questions here. We're just on a quick break, but it's coming to an end now. I believe Peter and Roger will come back to bring their slides up. But in the meantime, for those who are asking if this does qualify for the 2-year recurrency, it does. You simply put it in your logbook of both Peter and Roger's names and the title of the seminar. I'll just go on camera here. It's nice to see your face again, Roger. Yes, you put the name of today's seminar, the date, as well as both Peter and Roger's names. And if TC ever audits us, we'll have all your information within our database that you were actually here today. Another question here of the annual draw. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is show up. We track that information and through our handy tool here. And so in our December seminar, we will go through all of the entries that we have and select folks for that. Oh, there we go. I see that the screen is back up.
Yeah, we just had to restart it because of whatever reason, I'm not sure. So basically what Roger and I are doing with these couple of slides here is we're offering pilots a decision matrix that essentially says, you know, there's basically a simple yes, no. Is the equipment required for day or night VFR or IFR flight as applicable to the cars? If yes, guess what? The airplane's broken. If no, then, you know, you've got some alternatives, right? But anytime there's an airworthiness directive or something like that that is now broken, then under the cars, the aircraft is broken and maintenance is required. The responsibility, what we're trying to get to into people's heads is that they have a responsibility not only to themselves, but to their passengers and to the regulations that essentially says that we need to be responsible about how we maintain our airplanes. So there are a couple of specific cars. There are 60509 and 60510. Is that you can, under very specific circumstances, conduct a takeoff in an aircraft that has equipment that is not serviceable or from which equipment has been removed where the aircraft is operating in accordance with a flight permit that has been issued specifically for that purpose. Now, typically, you're not going to have a flight permit to go flying recreationally. A flight permit is something very specific where maybe you got into the situation that this checklist helped you and you determined that, hey, my airplane's broken. But guess what? I'm not at my AME's location. He or she is 100 miles away from me, right? And he or she can't get to me. So how do I get to my AME because there is nobody else at the field where you're at? That's what the flight permit is for, right? So there are always legal, safe, smart alternatives to doing the other thing, which is to ignore it and take the airplane flying anyway. That's against the rules, but we're trying to get you to not even go there in the first place, right? By having a very aware, smart look at the way things are supposed to be done. Alrighty, so that brings us to, hey, look at the end of part 2. Okay, so we're going to just jump into part 3 now, and we're going to start talking about the topics of safety and continuing airworthiness. And the intent here, what we're talking about really is most certified aircraft have been around for a while. And we want to, and even the ones like Rogers, Champ, that was built just yesterday. No, not exactly. We want to keep that airplane flying as long as possible. Things like airworthiness directives, you've heard us talk about it before, and we're going to talk about it a lot more right now, are things that have been put out by the aircraft manufacturer or the aircraft engine manufacturer to continue to keep our aircraft and its systems airworthy, meaning safe to fly. We also have things called CASs in Canada, which are Civil Aviation Safety Alerts. They're part of a system of reports, things like service difficulty reports, alerts, aircraft service bulletins, and letters. And they make up a database, that's a Canadian database called COPA for short, the Computerized Airworthiness Web Information System. What a mouthful. In French, it's le Système Web d'Information sur le maintien de la navigabilité, SWIM. I like that one, that's cool. So together, these two, all of this stuff is built into this idea of airworthiness directives. And I think, oh, it's actually mine, okay. So as we've said a couple times before, let's just go one more slide. As the owner of a type certified aircraft, you are the person responsible for the maintenance of your aircraft. You have, as we said earlier, legal custody and control. You must comply with all airworthiness directives for your aircraft, including for its airframe, engine, propeller, and for any fitted equipment. And we'll say that also en français. So, comme propriétaire d'un avion aéronef ayant un certificat de type, vous êtes la personne responsable de l'entretien de votre aéronef. Vous avez la garde et le contrôle légaux. Vous devez respecter toutes les consignes de navigabilité visant votre aéronef, y compris celles concernant sa cellule, son moteur et son hélice, ainsi que celles concernant tout équipement installé. Sorry, my French isn't that good, but I think you got that. Roger, my friend, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So it is a legal document. It signals an unsafe condition in AD. It's been discovered in an aircraft. And if you choose to ignore it, there be dragons, right? One of the phrases in the old aviation safety letter, it may still, I think it's still in it. I remember it because it's stuck in my head when I first got my pilot's license way back when. You know, learn from the mistakes of others. You won't live long enough to make them all yourself. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so you want to address them. And even if they put and say within the next 25 hours, if that's the time limit, I'd like to probably have it done in the next 3 or 4. But that's just me, because I know there's something that has potentially caused problems with it. So it's going to cause a substantive hazard, and there will be a network internationally to issue these across to the appropriate airworthiness agencies across the world, you know, to go through.
Right on. So the même chose en français.
So to comply, a lot of these will either say cease and desist until further flight, or it may say flight cycles, hours, calendar time. And we talked about this earlier on, so I'm not going to rehash too much about this, but there's all sorts of different flavors, right down to replacing pages in a POH, right, versus elements. To certify compliance, you know, it's got to be entered in the journey log and technical log. And, you know, if it's something fairly significant, I had with my glider 2 years ago an emergency AD that came out. I alluded to this earlier on, which was incorrect assembly possible for my horizontal stabilizer, which can be taken off and removed through an automatic control hookup scheme, very rigid and everything. But the factory for certain serial numbers of aircraft, the hole and notch, the square hole opening at the top, for whatever reason, was made about 1/4 of an inch wider on a few serial numbers than others. And it would allow you to put the tab that hold the horizontal stab in crooked. And it would look like it was seated properly. The automatic controls would kind of connect. And if you didn't do a positive control check, or control continuity check, you know, have somebody move the controls, somebody hold the control surface, you wouldn't necessarily know that it wasn't properly connected, although it looked completely right. Big deal. And so that required AME to inspect, to actually measure that notch. And I just use that as an example of a biggie, right, that you want to deal with. Yeah. aircraft engines, you've heard all sorts of biggies. You know, Lycoming's had a few big ones. Continental's had a few big ones. Crankshafts, camshafts. Man, you want to do it right and get it looked at quickly.
Right on.
ADs are optional for the following aircraft: amateur built and owner maintained. But I know, like the Vans site, they almost run a pseudo, you know, their service bulletins, I would almost consider their AD site. and you want to learn, you want to keep tabs of this stuff. This is where you don't want to cut corners. So even if you have an owner maintained aircraft that you've taken out of certified category, it's probably worthwhile keeping close tabs on these types of ADs. The other flavor is don't dismiss service bulletins either, as Peter alluded to. You know, service difficulty bulletins or service bulletins, because they're like usually the forerunner to an AD. In a lot of cases, they may result in an AD a year or two from now, but I have no intention of proving that theory out with my aircraft. So I like to look at service bulletins and say, yeah, let's take a gander at this and go through. And I've actually raised service difficulty requests. One in particular, which was with the landing gear extension mechanism on my glider many years ago. Came in, had a nice long flight, went into the circuit, tried to put my landing gear down, couldn't get it extended. So from 1,000 AGL to landing time, that in a glider is about 40 to 50 seconds. So had a beautiful 4-hour flight, and then all of a sudden the whole world came in, and I was like, okay, time for this airmanship stuff. You know, landed on the grass, no damage to the aircraft. Most gliders are designed for that kind of contingency. Picked into the wind as slow as I could, got out, and then I saw that part of the mechanism, when I looked at the gear extension mechanism, was from thin sheet metal that was bent. Could easily have been bent, moved aside, whatever the case may be from where. I took a picture of it. My wife was just shaking her head. Said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to need this for the SDR because there's about 400 of these aircraft flying in the world." Took the picture, we got it up, extended the gear, put it away, filed the SDR, also sent a copy to the manufacturer in Poland with the aircraft, got a response back, and there was henceforth a reinforcement that came out and a notice that came out. But if we all contribute to that safety pool, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not just a one-way street of receive. If you notice recurring problems, talk to your maintenance, head of maintenance, whoever, or if you're renting at an FTU or yourself, and look at the SDR elements, contribute to the SDRs. It's like a PIREP, right? It helps us all. You know, if you're getting into crap weather, let others know crap weather. So you can apply that to this type of stuff.
No, it's all very true, Roger. Like you say, it's a community effort, and it's a community that we're looking after. The that also, and it kind of covered on my next slide here, is this idea that but I don't own a type certified aircraft. I'm an amateur build. Well, sure you do, but you know what? If a particular airworthiness directive applies to your aircraft, maybe not, but maybe to your engine. You know, like Lycoming O or IO 360, or some kind of maybe you've got a special type of propeller, whether it's fixed or constant speed. There may be an airworthiness directive that comes with that. You know, your engine, for instance, if it's not brand new when you bought it, and it maybe not be brand new if you decide at some point to part your airplane out and sell it off, and that engine or that propeller ends up going on a type certified airplane, your compliance with the airworthiness directives that were applicable to that engine or that propeller when it was on your airframe now are even more important. So, you know, value. Well, yeah, the engine's only got 100 hours on it, but I didn't comply with any EDs in the meantime. Maybe your aircraft engine is worth almost nothing now. So we strongly recommend you comply with all of these airworthiness directives that apply not just to the airframe itself, but also the engine, propeller, or component. and it also helps keep you and your passengers safe. And CAR 625 ADs, Appendix H, is something you really want to have a good look at. All right, let's just go one more time here. So we do want you to follow airworthiness directives closely. Sometimes they're amended. An airworthiness directive that once didn't apply to your aircraft may all of a sudden change and apply. An AD, checks are important to have, right? The AIM Transport Canada publication 14371, Airworthiness Directives, is right in the AIM. It's right there, right? Let's turn this over to Roger for the next one. Oops. Yeah, there we go. Over to you, sir.
All right, Peter, thank you. So we have a wonderful website, as Peter alluded to, the CAWAS website. You don't need a login or password, so don't worry, it's not another password to lose, except for your annual report that you got to file for your aircraft, your annual airworthiness report. There you got to log in. But to pull out the applicable ADs to your aircraft, you can just pull them out any time of the day, 7/24. There is no reason to say you don't know. All right. Go ahead, Peter.
No, there you are. There you are, there, Roger. With the, if you want to mention the key to a lot of this is the AAIR, right?
Yeah, yeah. Your AAIR is also part of that push of information, not just the pull in the system, right? It is a bi-directional system, and it may seem trivial, to fill out the AAIR every year and put the number of hours you've flown and all that, but that can all be correlated to any SDRs that come up on that type of model, et cetera, back and forth across. This is a maintenance and airworthiness system. It's a living, breathing animal because no aircraft is perfect. So, we're in this endeavor where we have imperfect pilots flying imperfect aircraft. And so we need some pretty good systems to catch those weaknesses, right? It's just a fact of life.
Yeah, and the other thing that's important to take out of this slide is that it doesn't matter if it was a Cessna or a Beech or a Piper or something else that was built in the States, or a Diamond built in Canada, or a Pipistrel or something built in Europe. All these manufacturers are all interlinked. And if they know that you own one of those airplanes, then the information will get to you. But the key is that people need to know that you own the airplane.
Yeah.
All right. So I've got a slightly different slide here. Oh, there we go. Okay, now we're on the same spot. All right, so getting ADs. So we've kind of talked about it, right? We've talked about the AAIR. There's an email that you can send it to, subscribing you to Airworthiness Directives. But as Roger said, there is a pull side to this. And I think what I'm going to do now is turn over. Well, I'm going to have a quick quiz question first, and then I'll turn it over to Roger. So, question. Who's responsible for aircraft maintenance? Ooh. I know. Hopefully everybody's saying C, aircraft owner. Who's involved in aircraft maintenance? Well, it's just about everybody there, right? It's the aircraft owner. It could be an AME, it could be an AMO, right? But who's responsible? You are. All right. Roger, why don't you ask this question?
Yeah. Why is it important to review and complete airworthiness directives? Boy, I think we talked enough about this one today.
I think so.
Going through.
Yeah.
Because there's safety and you want to stay alive, right? And
it's
you want to
also
stay
mandatory, but it's not mandatory for owner maintenance aircraft. It's advisable, right?
Advisable.
It's definitely B for sure. Yep.
Yep.
All right, Roger, I'm going to let you take the helm here, and why don't we jump to
that one.
Here's the COWIS website, and then Roger, if you want to share your screen after that.
Yeah. Okay. So when you Google COWIS, and you'll get to this page, and you can scroll down, and on the left-hand side you'll see quick search, and that can get you to the ADs. And when you go pull up an AD, let me bring up a screen here. There, and I'll be sharing. Is that coming up?
Yep.
Is that full screen? Is that better now?
Not yet, but sometimes it takes a second to actually get through the internet.
Let me know when you can see it. If not, I'll shrink it here. Not yet? Oh, hang on. Maybe I had the wrong screen here. Is that coming up now?
I still see 2 pages, so...
Oops. Hang on. There. I'll get rid of that. No, it's only showing the one. Move that down. How about that?
It's not bad. It's okay. I think what people see, it's a bit of an eye chart for sure.
It's fuzzy. Yeah. Apologies, folks.
But what people see on their screens, and Roger, I'll turn the mic back over to you. But this is what you see for your airplane. So tell us what we're looking at here, Roger.
Yeah. What I did is I put in the registration for my Champ, and it highlights 3 flavors, if you want, of ADs. And apologies again for it, but some of these directives go back to 1948, 1949. Some of them are as recent as 2015, 2013. And oops, what happened? I think I lost the screen. Can you still see it?
I just see white now.
Oh, that's interesting. Let me stop sharing and go back. Hang on. There. Oh, interesting.
Now, Roger, when you're sharing, are you adding only the screen, the window?
Yeah. How's that? Is it coming back?
Yeah, it's back where it was. We'll just leave it at this.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Yep.
Yeah.
So on the left-hand side, it's a snippet. There's a much longer list of ADs. And what I do is, I print this out every year when we go through our annual and say, hey, can you see, take a look at all this stuff. I research it a bit. What I find is interesting, especially for older aircraft, is even if the AD was called out in 1950 or my aircraft's 1946, I'll look at them because you never know for sure. And when I bought the aircraft, we crawled through it. Oh boy, it doesn't like it. We crawled through it to bring up and show the elements of the aircraft to our AME and say, hey, has this been complied with? Can you recheck this? And I tell you, that was the best couple $100 we spent going through some of these easy legacy ADs just to make sure, because man, 70 years is a long time of logbooks, right? And varying degrees of maintenance. The one on the left here is for the engine. These are applicable ADs for the A65, the mighty 65 horsepower Continental. And some of them are fairly recent, some of them are really old. And there's even some for the propeller. And the ones in my case with the propeller were people and organizations that had overhauled propellers, this particular model, that had since lost their certification as an overhaul facility. And there was some question as to how good the overhaul work was done. So vital part, of owning an aircraft is knowing these weaknesses. Don't just look at the last 10, look at the whole history and take a look at those aircraft. And honestly, if you are really suspicious about them, print out the AD, talk to your AME, these old ones, and just, are they applicable? Are they still going through? And, have they actually been complied? If you've brought aircraft in from out of Canada, I have seen horror stories where the paperwork, in one case, an aircraft brought from the US, the paperwork said all the ADs for the particular engine. It was for an 0540, the big Lycoming 6, 235 horsepower engine. All ADs were complied with. All of a sudden, it started misfiring after about 50 hours. There was only about 100 hours total on the engine, recently overhauled. Sent it off to the shop. Shop came back and said there were about 6 ADs on that Lycoming motor which were not addressed in that engine, even though the paperwork said.
Yeah.
So paper's what it's worth. Seeing, checking, inspecting may be the best. If you're spending $1,500 a year to insure it, maybe spend $300-500 to double check those old ADs. That's all I would say.
Right on, Roger. It's I think you were. I was going to say it, and you said it for me. This kind of stuff it basically has 3 applicabilities to it. Certainly before you buy it, right?
Yeah.
This is a great research tool. While you own it, it's for the annual inspection and just for your own self-satisfaction. And what we're going to talk about next month, planning for that annual inspection. This is a key aspect, as Roger has said, to that process. Definitely part of it. Roger, if you want to unshare, I'm going to start I'm going to just go here now. No, it says here, stop this live presentation. I guess I got to go start it. Let's start. Boom, there we go. All right. So ladies and gents, we are now finished with part 3. We're going to jump ahead into part 4, and we're going to start kind of summarizing, but not quite yet. So, okay, did I get ahead of myself? Yeah, all right. So here are some tips to guide your decision making, right? These are maintenance owner tips, okay? There's a lot of them, and they're inside these cars. Cars 571, Cars 605. We talked about schedules. We talked about elementary maintenance in Appendix A of 625. Schedules in Part B. Abnormal events in G. H is, of course, where we have other things. 571, parts documentation. ELT maintenance in 571-025. Which is an advisory circular. Safety belts, 60504. We didn't really talk about that one. Your safety belts need to be inspected as well, and that circular helps you with that. Form 1 is a document you'll become very familiar with when it comes to with parts. Application for a flight permit, there's the link as well. Oops, we'll just go one more slide here. So, starting to wrap up a little bit. We've seen many cars today, probably more cars today than you saw during your entire PPL ground school, maybe even more than that. Some of the important references you saw today, we've already talked about it. It's 571. It's the standard for aircraft maintenance, and if you know how the air regs are broken into parts, the 500 series is the big one for aircraft maintenance. Car 600, but in this case, specifically 605, many aspects of flight operations. That's where we saw our different standards for day VFR, night VFR, VFR over the top, and IFR, right? The standards that go with that 605, appendixes A, B, C, and G, and others, parts documentation, ELT maintenance, safety belts, the airworthiness manual, and one thing that I will repeat is getting to know the FAA's safety videos. There is a wealth of great references for making us smarter about our aircraft ownership life. So, Roger, why don't you do the summary slide? I know it was actually supposed to be mine, but I'm going to let you talk.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Peter. Your part in all of this, what we talked about, your responsibilities as an owner, responsibilities that you used to rely on your FTU, that is now part of ship. You have to know what's going on. It is not an arm's length thing. It's a member of your family, your aircraft. We talked about airworthiness documentation associated with that, and the maintenance, modifications, how to deal with snags, decisions. We gave you some framework on, a decision-making element for what is a no-go situation, what is a maybe go, what needs to be done to make that maybe go into a full go. And I think, Peter's last couple slides here, the tips are probably very, very valuable. If there's nothing else from the presentation deck, is, the slides with the tips and the elements in there are absolutely key, to go forward. Next slide, Peter.
Absolutely.
Of course, the aviation safety letter, I only quoted it once today, but it's made an impression on me, and I love reading it. And, we used to get our paper copies, but now it's available online. So not a big deal to sign up to get it and take a look at it. Please, there's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of good. So there I was stories that go through there. So subscribe and take some time to read.
Absolutely.
It's all part of airmanship.
Yep.
But then there's also other stuff. All of the historical seminars, as Peter will allude to, are available on COPA site, and there's TC handouts. The AIM, I love the AIM because it's cars and plane speak. A lot of times I'll get confused with the cars, and then I'll whip out the AIM, and it gets me recentered and refocused, and then I could go back into the cars and get confused again. No, not quite that bad, but the AIM is written in pilot talk through there. And COPA safety program and investment in safety over the last while is quite dramatic. And I'll add one more element to this whole thing is your local flying club. If you're a renter or if you're an owner, please maybe talk to the members of your club. Maybe you aren't a member of a club. Join a club. And even if you do something as simple as pick a night where somebody will tell about their cross-country flights and flight they did to Oshkosh or whatever, and what went right, what went wrong. What did they learn? What happened to them? And even if you do that like one night a month or one night a quarter or something, and something as simple as that, doesn't need to be PowerPoint, but to get yourself talking with your peers and others about flight safety. That is the grassroots. That sets the culture. That sets the safety. That's the other set of eyes that look over your shoulder and go, are you sure you want to do that? And you go, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't do that. And it's very, very valuable from a club perspective. So try to invest at that level, as well as all these other things that Peter and I have been talking about. But don't forget about it. All starts at the grassroots, and there's a lot of knowledge out there, and a lot of people will love to talk about the knowledge. So why not learn?
Exactly. The one of the things that's been very easy to do in the last 18 plus months is to become kind of isolated and insular with the whole COVID thing. We've been told the lockdown, stay at home, all the rest of that stuff. And we've also been kind of kept away from our airplanes, those that own them and those that fly them recreationally. That's changing, and we need to get back into the community ethos and learn from others, as Roger said quite appropriately, because you can't live long enough to make all the same mistakes again, and you may not survive it anyway. So the reason for a lot of what we're doing today and in previous weeks and months is to reinvest in the community of aviation, to get that understanding and learning broadened and shared. And one of the things that this meeting about today is the fact that it is a pilot recurrency training program seminar, and the summary of it, and here's how, and Sharon alluded to it earlier, but here's what you need to do. To record this in your logbook, write in your logbook on the right-hand side, right? Today's date, the September 18th, presenter's name, yours truly, Peter Campbell. The title of the training seminar, Private Aircraft Owners Maintenance Responsibilities. Your signature below the above. And below that, below your signature, the CARS references 40108-1B and 40108-3, because those are the references that say that this was a PRTP, and that gives you recurrency for the next 24 months. But please, 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 please fly. Go up and take flight in your aircraft, whether it be rented or owned, and enjoy the freedom to fly, because that's why we're here and that's why we're doing all of this stuff and taking your time. Appreciate the 460 or so people that have joined us today. We're going to conclude here and open up the question and answer period. So help us improve general aviation safety. I do want to also thank very much Roger for his outstanding co-hosting today. Et aidez-nous à l'amélioration de la sécurité de l'aviation générale. COPA and TC want us to work together with you and you with us to include all manned and unmanned aviators and operators. You know what? By the way, there's Simon Garrett's email address. There's mine, and Sharon, I'll turn it over to you, and we can field questions.
Okay, fantastic. I'm just going to test out that my mic is working. First of all, I'm having internet issues today.
You sound good.
Excellent.
You look great too.
Let's give ourselves even a bigger zoom in. So fantastic presentation, Roger, Peter. It's good that we have you signed on for October as well, Roger. Be careful, you might become a staple of this program moving forward. Let's get into it so we could just take advantage of the time that we have together. There were a few comments on including more considerations for amateur built or those who own or operate an amateur built aircraft. So I'll go through where I can. Starting with, can you speak more to the difference in requirements between certified and amateur built equipment or aircraft, pardon me. Specifically, is the main difference that on who can and must do the work?
So we've structured our program today for certified aircraft and for private registered airplanes. There are annual inspections required for amateur built aircraft. But the requirements as far as who does the work and all that are a little bit different, because there is no type certificate for an amateur built aircraft. There are kit built designs and things like that. So in many cases, the owner of the aircraft is amateur built, does his or her own maintenance as well. But I would suggest that because we have really focused ourselves a lot on that, I would talk to, if you've got a vans, get support from your local airport or aircraft owners group. It's my understanding that a lot of what you can do is as amateur built is to your own. But as Roger said himself, or as Roger said, and I would echo this, is that if you're not comfortable with what you're doing, then don't do it. Get smarter about what it is that you can do, and then be good at doing it. Right? There's nothing worse than half maintenance, right? And the whole point of being an amateur built owner is that you may have built it, and hopefully therefore you know how to maintain it. If you've acquired an amateur built aircraft, but you really don't know how to maintain it, then you really do want the help of either somebody who is qualified to do it, an AME. And let's not forget too that AMEs, aircraft maintenance engineers, hold qualifications to work on certain type of aircraft. So there is no AME certification for an amateur built airplane, right? He has skills on how to maintain aircraft, metal made, fabric made, composite made aircraft. But he doesn't necessarily, or she doesn't necessarily have any more specific certified skills to work on your amateur built plane than you do. But he can probably give you some great guidance on how to maintain it.
Okay, awesome. Just switching over to performance ELT tests, could you speak more to that? And let's tie it into the amateur builds. Can it be done with amateur builds?
So I think I saw the question and I did give you an answer to it, but I think there's some confusion here. So the performance test is the performance of the ELT. It's not a performance of the aircraft. The EL, there is even a different requirement between certified aircraft and amateur build, whether they're even carrying it or not. But the performance testing of an ELT, especially if it's a 406, has to be done in a avionics shop that can do the test, because it's the avionics expert who will certify that the test has been done.
Okay, I think that was pretty clear. Obviously, being Canadians, we often look to our neighbors down south and compare our standards, our requirements and responsibilities to our American counterparts. There was a question on if owners are held to a higher responsibility here in Canada versus the US, specifically asking what the difference in responsibility is when it comes to aircraft maintenance between the owner and the AME or mechanic with TC and FAA.
Honestly, I do not feel qualified to answer that question because I don't really know the FAA system all that well. I barely know our own. So I don't have a comment. I don't know.
Yeah.
Roger, do you have any insight into that?
No, I was going to answer the same thing. I know it'd be a real mixed soup in the U.S. And I'd like us all to think, if whenever we feel like we're frustrated with Transport Canada and approvals and STCs and everything else, just be thankful that you're not necessarily dealing in the U.S. because they have all these other ways to raise alternate forms of compliance. You'll hear 337 forms, but they're managed at the local office. They're not managed nationally. So you could get a 337 for a modification approved out of the Albany FSDO and then move to California, and the inspectors there will go, I don't recognize that. And that's okay. And so it's hard.
There is a lot of regional differences in the states, and there are significant differences. One big difference I will talk to between Canada and the States when it comes to aircraft engines. In Canada, when an aircraft engine eventually, either because of age or time, is no longer deemed airworthy, the overhaul standard in Canada is essentially what the Americans call factory reman. And essentially, you've got a new engine. In the States, there are many other different types of overhauls. And, a qualified shop in the States could do an engine rebuild, which in Canada, as an overhaul, would not meet requirements. But it does meet the requirements in the States. So it's a very much a buyer beware, and there have been many people who have been burnt or worse by assuming that their aircraft engine that came on the airplane they bought from the States was just like the new engine that came from an engine overhaul shop in either Nova Scotia or the province of Quebec in Canada. And it's not. And those assumptions can lead to some disappointments or worse. But and this is kind of more of a last month's thing about knowing what you're buying, but even knowing what you're owning, because the standards in Canada for things like engines and the standards in the States for engine overhauls can be very different.
It's really good consideration here. There was even a comment earlier on how what was it here? Let me just make sure I'm looking at it. The journey log isn't a requirement in the US, at least I assume in some parts.
Well, the journey logs, I think the actual comment is that what tends to happen in the States is that journey logs, there isn't necessarily a requirement for tech logs in the States. So that everything gets dumped into the journey log, right? So very messy in the way data is entered in the journey log in the States. Phil talked about this last month during the August seminar. So trying to make an apples to apples comparison between a Canadian 20-year-old history in Canadian logbooks versus a 20-year-old history in American logbooks can be a very frustrating experience because they're not equal. They're not the same.
Okay, very good. Let's switch gears, and while we do over to airworthiness directives, someone had asked that I put back the slide with the logbook information, so I'll just keep that up for folks who need to access to that. There was a question here on where you find ADs for a particular aircraft. Does that type of resource exist?
That was right in our presentation. That's the COPA's website. And
so we'll ensure to link that back here for those who may have missed that. And just a note here, if you did miss anything, there is a recording of today's session that will send out in a few short days. Okay. A few more specific questions, we're just looking at time here. Maybe I'll take one or two. There was one earlier, and I think this was maybe part one or part two of the presentation. Why wouldn't a landing light not be mandatory in any night flight, regardless of having a passenger or not?
Basically, well, I'm not the Minister of Transport, so I can only give you my impression of things. But my understanding of it is that essentially we're talking about risk management, whereas my understanding of the landing light situation is that, nobody's telling you, the pilot, if you're flying solo by yourself at night, that you don't want it. But if you're carrying a passenger at night, you must have a serviceable light, right? So basically what we're saying is that they don't want to put the passenger at risk by your mistake. And they just deem that the passenger's safety requires that there be a functional landing light. Sort of the undertone, if you will, is saying that you by yourself are only putting yourself at risk, but once you put a passenger on board, the risk is deemed high enough that the passenger's safety comes into it. And that if you read Cars a lot, which unfortunately I've done a lot in the last year, the passenger versus the pilot issue comes up a lot. As soon as you carry a passenger on board, the rules change. The risk, the acceptable risk level drops to a lower level. So what they're saying is that a pilot landing a single engine airplane by him or herself at night solo, it's a little risky. Put a passenger on board, now we want a landing light so that the risk of hurting the passenger is lower. And that theme is one of the themes that runs through Cars right from front to back.
Okay, very good. Are there any comments you'd like to add regarding the 24-month altimeter / transponder inspection, specifically around requirements?
Alternator transponder inspection. I think you mean the altimeter.
Altimeter reading, like altimeter.
So that is a pedostatic and interface with the encoding altimeter test that you're talking about, I think. And that is to make sure that both so one of the things that's required to enter controlled airspace is a functional, basically you're able to have the transponder is able to properly broadcast your altitude. And to properly broadcast your altitude, the encoding part of the transponder system has to read and interface properly with the altimeter. So that's why every 24 months, there's two things. There's a pedostatic functional test. In other words, does it work? Does your airspeed indicate properly? Does your altimeter indicate properly? And the second part of that is, does the encoding, sort of the analog to digital interface work? So that if you are at 5,000 feet, we'll say for the sake of a number, does the encoding altimeter system transmit that accurately? Yes or no? Pass or fail? Roger?
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's dimensions to it, right? Because it's a pneumatic system. It can leak. Pneumatics are not, electronics. And like Peter said, it's correlating what your altimeter is saying with what it's being transmitted. And if they're 500 feet apart, that's not good.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
It's safety related, really.
Very, very much so. I'll ask one last question, and we'll leave it there. So, of course, you've both given us gold when it comes to aircraft maintenance information today, and very much so looking forward to next month's seminar on annual inspections. I left a link in the chat, and I'm happy to repost it for anyone who missed it. Let's provide a high level recap. What do you want our audience to specifically walk away learning today? Maybe one or 2 points, and we'll start with Roger.
My personal wish for everybody is maybe take the time to get to know your aircraft better, and that's airworthiness directives, where the warts are. Even if you have a list of things that need to be addressed, short-term, long-term. The second part I would like all of us to do is, if you don't have a good relationship with an AME, become their best friend. Okay. Really get to know your AME, get to know your aircraft, understand the warts of it, and use that extra set of eyes. And the final aspect is link in other like knowledge through your club, through EAA, if you got amateur built aircraft, or RAA. There's a lot of knowledge in clubs. There's a reason why clubs exist in aviation. Link that in. To me, it's information, knowledge, continuous learning related to your aircraft and maintenance.
Well said.
Okay, well, excellent. I think that this seminar really set those who are interested in aircraft maintenance up for success. That concludes our event today. If you have any questions that maybe weren't answered, and you really do, or you're really itching for us to touch upon that, send us a note. Peter had shared his email earlier, but if not, COPA at copanational.org, and we'll get back to you. Until then, we'll see you at next month's seminar. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Roger. It was a pleasure to have you both here today, and we'll see you again next month.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.